You ever notice how something so simple can completely wreck your brain if you actually stop and think about it? Like this classic riddle. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? You hear it as a kid and you laugh it off. But sit with it as an adult, and suddenly this tiny question pulls you into one of the strangest paradoxes in science. Because no matter which side you choose, it collapses in on itself. Before we continue, a quick note. Many of you watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet, so please subscribe to our channel Restwise and join our growing community. We'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to see how connected we all are. If you enjoy relaxing with philosophy, psychology, and science while drifting into sleep, give this video a like and stay with us on the journey. Now, let's get back to the video. At first glance, it seems obvious. The chicken must come first. How else would the egg appear? An egg without a chicken is just a random rock sitting in the dirt. But here is the problem. If the chicken came first, then what did it hatch from? And if the egg came first, who laid it? You are stuck in this infinite loop that refuses to spit out a clean answer. It is almost like trying to find the very first domino in a chain that never had a beginning. And here is the part that will trip you up even more. This is not just a silly playground puzzle. Biologists, philosophers, and even mathematicians have wrestled with it because the chicken and the egg are not just about chickens. They are a metaphor for every cause and effect problem that humans run into. Every time you ask yourself, did this happen because of that? Or did that happen because of this? You are basically living inside the chicken and egg paradox. Now get ready for the shocker. Science actually tried to solve this. Researchers looked at proteins required to form an eggshell, and they discovered something called ovoclitidin 17. It is a protein found only inside a chicken's ovaries, which means, technically, no chicken, no eggshell. On paper, that suggests the chicken came first. Mystery solved, right? Except not at all, because the moment you celebrate that win, another question smacks you in the face. Where did that first chicken come from? It could not have popped into existence out of thin air. It had to evolve from a bird that was not quite a chicken yet. And how do species evolve? Through eggs. Suddenly, we are back at the start of the loop. And this is where it messes with your sense of logic. We humans crave straight lines. We want to believe in firsts and lasts, beginnings and endings. But nature does not play by those rules. Nature loves circles. Evolution is gradual. At some point, a bird that was almost a chicken laid an egg containing the genetic mutation that became the first real chicken. But if you zoom in on that moment, which do you point to as the true beginning? Was it the egg containing that mutation, or the animal that laid it? The line between them blurs until it disappears, and here is where the emotional punch lands. The reason this riddle stings so much is because it reflects how powerless we are when we demand a perfect answer from a system that does not offer one. You might think about your own life this way. Do you feel the way you do because of the things happening to you? Or are things happening to you because of the way you feel? Is your success the cause of your confidence? Or is your confidence the cause of your success? The truth is often a messy loop, not a neat line. This is why philosophers treat the chicken and egg question as a lesson in humility. It reminds us that not every problem has a clean origin story. Sometimes the search for the first step is the trap itself. When you get caught inside a loop, the harder you dig for the single true cause, the more it slips away. That is why arguments about relationships, politics, even personal struggles often feel endless. Because both sides keep demanding to know which part came first, when in reality both parts feed each other. And yet, we keep circling back to it. Because deep down we are obsessed with finding roots. We want to believe there was a clear first spark that lit everything else. That one switch we can point to and say there it is, the true beginning. But the chicken and egg paradox refuses to give us that satisfaction. Instead, it whispers the unsettling idea that beginnings are illusions. What we call a beginning is often just the middle of another story. That is the tease that keeps this loop alive. Because if we accept that there was no clean first chicken and no clean first egg, then what else in life has no true beginning? Maybe time itself, maybe the universe, maybe the story of you. The more you sit with that thought, the more you realize that this little farmyard riddle is not trivial at all. It is a mirror held up to the biggest mysteries of existence. And that is why the chicken and the egg never go away. They survive not because people are curious about barnyard animals, but because they tap into our deepest fear and fascination. The fear of infinite regress, the fascination with circular causality, the loop that refuses to end. You can laugh at it, roll your eyes at it, but once you step into it, it tightens around you. And the harder you struggle to pull it apart, the stronger the loop becomes. So here we are, centuries of thought, billions of conversations, countless jokes, and still no final answer. Just a circle that eats itself, the chicken and the egg, the paradox that science, logic, and philosophy cannot untangle. Time travel loops. Imagine this. You step into a time machine, flip a switch, and launch yourself into the past. You run into your younger self, you say one little thing, and suddenly you realize you may have just changed the entire future. But here is the nightmare twist. What if the future you came from only existed because you went back in the first place? That is the rabbit hole of time travel loops. At first glance, it feels like a cool plot device from movies, a fun way to mess with characters and give the audience a headache. But then it hits you. These loops are not just fiction. They are serious questions in physics and philosophy. Because if time travel is possible, even in theory, then the entire structure of cause and effect begins to wobble. Here is where the shock kicks in. Let's take the classic grandfather paradox. Imagine you travel back and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. If you succeed, you were never born. But if you were never born, you could not have gone back in the first place. That creates a loop with no exit. A situation where both outcomes cancel each other out, but both are required for the loop to exist. That is not just confusing. That is logic setting itself on fire. Now, some scientists tried to solve this by proposing what is called the Novikov self-consistency principle. It basically says you can go back in time, but you cannot actually change the past. Whatever you do already happened. So if you tried to stop your grandfather, something would get in the way, and history would stay intact. You would always end up being part of the story that led to your own existence. It sounds neat, but if you think about it long enough, it is even creepier. Because that would mean your free will is an illusion. Every choice you think you are making in the past is already scripted. And that brings us to the validation moment. Why do these loops grab us so hard? Because they expose the limits of how our minds understand time. We imagine time as a line. First this, then that, a clean chain of events. But physics tells us time may be more like a landscape, where all points exist simultaneously. When you look at it that way, time loops are not bugs in the system. They are features baked into the fabric of reality. Think about the Bootstrap Paradox. Imagine a musician from the future travels back and hands Beethoven his own sheet music. Beethoven performs it, the music survives. Centuries later, the future musician finds it and takes it back to Beethoven, who actually composed it. There is no origin. The creation exists in a closed loop, and this is not just philosophy class thought experiments. The universe might actually allow this. Quantum physics suggests information cannot be destroyed, only transferred, which means closed time like curves, as some physicists call them, might not break the laws of physics at all. But here is what really shakes you. If loops like this are possible, then the very idea of originality collapses. You could be influenced by something that technically came from you in the future. You could be living inside a feedback cycle where no beginning ever existed. Your identity, your choices, your history might not be linear at all. Now here is the part that makes it personal. Ever feel like you keep making the same decisions over and over? Like no matter how many times you try to change, you find yourself back in the same spot. That is a psychological time loop. The loop does not need a time machine. It just needs repetition. Humans run on patterns, and when those patterns lock, life feels circular. The science fiction paradox suddenly mirrors your day-to-day reality. And yet, we keep reaching for time travel stories, maybe because deep down we crave the idea of rewriting, of stepping into the past and nudging one little moment. We imagine freedom hiding in that loop, but the paradox reminds us that freedom may not be as clean as we want. Every change creates a contradiction. Every contradiction creates a loop, and the loop swallows the change whole. That is the tease that makes time travel loops so addictive, because they whisper a terrifying possibility. What if the universe is not a straight road with a beginning and an end? What if it is a circle, and every step you take just leads you back to the start? You would never know, because from inside the loop, it feels like progress. It feels like movement. But the bigger picture might reveal something else. Time travel loops refuse to untangle because they are not just puzzles about physics. They are mirrors reflecting our hunger for control, our fear of fate, and our obsession with causality. They remind us that the question is not simply, can we travel back? The real question is, if we did, would we ever escape the loop at all? So here we are, staring at the possibility that time itself might not be a line we move across, but a knot we can never loosen. A knot that tightens the more we try to pull it apart. The loop wins. Every time. Mind versus brain? Close your eyes for a second and ask yourself this. Who is thinking the thought you just had? Was it your brain or was it your mind? The words feel interchangeable, but the moment you press on them, they pull apart and refuse to snap back together. That tension, mind versus brain, is one of the strangest causal loops we have never managed to untangle. The brain is flesh. A 3-pound lump of neurons, electrical sparks, and chemicals sloshing around in a skull. The mind is experience. The voice you hear when you talk to yourself. The memories that sting years later. The stories you build about who you are. And here comes the problem. The brain is supposed to create the mind, but the mind clearly changes the brain. Which one comes first? At first you might say, obviously the brain. Damage the brain, and the mind unravels. A stroke, a tumor, a single blow to the head can erase language, personality, even entire decades of memory. It feels like solid proof that the brain is the cause and the mind is just the effect. But then something weird happens. A thought, just a thought, can reshape the brain. Meditate for a few months, and the physical structure of your brain changes. Fall in love, and chemicals start flooding your neural pathways. Believe you can heal, and sometimes your body listens. The immaterial shapes the material. The effect becomes the cause. And here is where the shock hits. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. It means your brain is not fixed hardware. It rewires itself based on your experiences, your beliefs, your intentions. Which means your mind, the thing supposedly born out of brain activity, actually loops back and reprograms the machine that made it. That is not just poetic. That is measurable in MRI scans. The chicken and the egg, except the farmyard, has been replaced by your skull. Now think about free will. If the brain is only chemistry and physics, then every choice you make is just atoms colliding. Your decision to watch this video, your decision to pause it, even your decision to disagree with me right now, all of it could be pre-written by physical processes you never see. But at the same time, the subjective experience of choosing feels undeniably real. You feel like a mind steering a brain, not just a brain pretending to be a mind. Which one is true? If the brain controls the mind, then why does the mind fight back? And if the mind controls the brain, where does the mind even live? This is where the philosophers jump in. Some say the mind is an emergent property, like a flame rising from a match. The flame is real, but it only exists because of the chemical reaction. Others argue for dualism, the old idea that the mind is something separate from matter. But if that is true, how does something immaterial push around neurons and cells? Every explanation collapses into another question. Here is what makes it even more unsettling. In everyday life, you already live inside this loop. Ever felt anxious about being anxious? Your brain triggers fear, your mind interprets it, and then your interpretation loops back and makes your brain even more fearful, a spiral with no clear entry point. Or think about creativity. Your brain produces random sparks of connection, your mind shapes them into an idea. That idea then changes your behavior, and your behavior rewires your brain. It is an endless back and forth where cause and effect blur into each other. And the validation comes from recognizing this is not some abstract debate. It is the core of being human. Your identity depends on how you answer it. If the brain alone is in charge, then you are basically a biological puppet. If the mind is real and independent, then maybe you have more power than science admits. Either way, you are stuck in a paradox. The brain gives birth to the mind, and the mind reshapes the brain. No clean first cause, just a loop that feeds itself. But the tease is this. What if the whole question is wrong? What if there is no mind separate from brain, and no brain without mind? What if they are two sides of the same coin, and the coin itself is something we do not yet have the language to describe? Every time we think we have nailed it down, it slips away. We build machines to scan neurons. We measure electrical pulses, but the raw feeling of being you never shows up on the screen. Consciousness is the ghost science cannot trap, the loop science cannot break, and that is why the debate keeps haunting us. Because it is not just about science, it is about meaning. If your mind is just the byproduct of neurons firing, then love, art, joy, pain, every human story is just electricity. But if your mind is something more, then maybe you are not just a machine. Maybe you are a mystery the machine cannot contain. So here we are. Centuries of philosophy, decades of neuroscience, billions of human lives lived, and still no final answer. Just a loop, endlessly circling, whispering back and forth. The brain creates the mind. The mind changes the brain, round and round without a beginning, without an end. Climate feedbacks. The planet starts to warm by just a tiny fraction of a degree. It seems harmless, almost invisible. But that little nudge kicks off a reaction, and that reaction doubles back and makes the warming worse. That, in a nutshell, is a climate feedback loop. And once you see how it works, it is terrifying, because it is not a straight line we are fighting against. It is a circle that feeds itself. Take ice, for example. When ice covers the poles, it reflects sunlight back into space like a mirror. That keeps the planet cooler. But as temperatures rise, that ice melts. Less ice means less reflection. More of the sun's energy gets absorbed by the darker ocean underneath. The ocean warms faster, which melts more ice, which exposes more water, which absorbs more heat. The loop tightens. What looked like a slow drift becomes an accelerating spiral, and that is just one loop. Here is another that will shock you. Permafrost. For thousands of years, huge amounts of carbon have been locked away in frozen ground across Siberia, Canada, and Alaska. As the climate warms, that permafrost starts to thaw. Once it does, microbes wake up and begin releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Those gases trap heat in the atmosphere, which warms the planet further, which melts even more permafrost. Suddenly, the ground itself becomes a ticking time bomb that fuels its own destruction. Now here is the part people do not realize. Feedback loops do not care about politics. They do not wait for agreements. They do not negotiate. Once they start, they run on autopilot. Scientists warn about tipping points because loops like these can push the system past a threshold where human intervention barely matters. Think of it like leaning back in a chair. At first you can rock safely, but once you pass that balance point, gravity takes over. You are going down whether you like it or not. And yet, there is another twist. Feedbacks can also move in the opposite direction. Forests, for instance, act like giant lungs. They pull carbon out of the air and store it. But when they burn, not only do they stop absorbing carbon, they release it back into the atmosphere, fueling the very fire that destroyed them. It is a cruel loop. But protecting forests can also create a stabilizing feedback. More trees mean more carbon pulled out of the air, which slows warming, which keeps ecosystems healthier, which allows more trees to grow. The same mechanism that threatens us can also save us. This is where the emotional gut punch lands. Because humans are part of the loop too. Our choices about energy, food, and consumption feed directly into these cycles. Burn more fossil fuels and the loops accelerate. Shift to cleaner energy and you start nudging them in the other direction. But here is the catch. The loops are bigger and slower than us, which means we often do not feel the consequences until decades later, when the momentum is already locked in. That time delay is its own trap. It tricks us into thinking we still have more room than we really do. And yet, this is not just about science. It is about psychology. Ever notice how worry feeds itself? You worry about the future, which stresses you, and the stress makes you worry even more. Or how habits spiral. Eat poorly, you feel low energy. Low energy makes you crave quick comfort food, which pulls you deeper into the same rut. That is a feedback loop in your own life. And when you see how your mind works, you start to recognize that the planet is doing the exact same thing, only on a global scale. The validation is this: climate feedbacks are not random chaos. They follow patterns we can understand. And once you see those patterns, the world stops looking like a collection of isolated events and starts looking like a living system. Fires, floods, storms, droughts, melting glaciers. They are not disconnected headlines. They are the visible edges of loops spinning underneath. But the tease that lingers is this. What if climate is not just a problem we can fix with a checklist of actions? What if it is a self-organizing loop that will never return to what we call normal? What if the feedbacks we fear are not accidents, but the natural way complex systems evolve? Maybe the planet itself is teaching us something brutal about cause and effect, about how actions echo back in ways we cannot predict. So here we are. The ice, the forests, the oceans, the atmosphere, and us, all locked in a feedback circle that refuses to untangle. A loop that can either spiral into collapse or stabilize into balance. Which way it goes depends on whether we understand the loop in time, or keep pretending it is just a straight line. Gödel's strange loop. Think about this. Every system we build to explain the world is like a ladder. You climb it step by step, hoping that at the top you will find solid ground, the final truth. But what if, when you reach the top, the ladder bends back down and connects to its own bottom? That is what mathematician Gödel uncovered. A strange loop where logic itself chases its tail. At first, it sounds impossible. Math is supposed to be the one place where certainty lives. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. Proofs are airtight. If any system in the universe should be immune to paradox, it is mathematics. But Gödel, in the 1930s, shattered that illusion with his incompleteness theorems. He showed that no matter how carefully you design a system of logic, there will always be statements inside it that cannot be proven true or false using only that system's own rules. Here is the shocking part. To prove his point, Gödel built a kind of self-referential sentence inside mathematics. A sentence that essentially said, this statement cannot be proven. If the system proves it, the system contradicts itself. If the system cannot prove it, then the statement is true. Either way, the system caves in on itself. The loop wins. And this is not just abstract math games. This idea spills out into philosophy, computer science, even how you think about your own mind. Douglas Hofstadter later called it a strange loop. A structure that circles back to include itself. Like a mirror reflecting a mirror. Like a thought thinking about itself. The brain is made of neurons, yet those neurons somehow create a mind that can look at the brain and ask, what am I? The system includes itself in the system. That is the same flavor of paradox Gödel uncovered. Now here is where it starts to validate your everyday experience. Have you ever caught yourself doubting your own doubt? Or asking, am I really free, or am I just programmed to believe I am free? That self-referential spiral is a strange loop. You are both inside the thought and outside of it at the same time. Just like Gödel's sentence was both inside mathematics and about mathematics at the same time. This is where the emotional sting lands. Because the human mind craves closure. We want to believe there is a master system, a final truth, a framework where every question has an answer. Gödel showed us that no matter how high we climb, the ladder always bends back. Certainty is an illusion. Every explanation eventually points to something it cannot explain, and that is deeply unsettling. Imagine building a computer powerful enough to check every possible truth. Gödel tells you that no matter how powerful it gets, there will always be truths it cannot touch, paradoxes it cannot dissolve. Even artificial intelligence, built on logic and code, is bound by this rule. There will always be questions the machine cannot settle from within its own framework. But here is the tease. What if this loop is not a bug, but a feature? What if consciousness itself arises because systems can reflect on themselves? A brain that only processed information would just be a calculator. But a brain that can turn inward, that can include itself in its own map, suddenly generates awareness. The very loop that breaks mathematics may be the loop that creates mind. Think about art. An artist paints a picture of a hand drawing a hand. A writer writes a story about a writer writing a story. These loops fascinate us because they mimic the strange loop we live inside every day. We are systems thinking about systems, minds thinking about minds, stories writing stories. It is dizzying, but it feels alive. And the most unsettling part is this: Gödel's loop suggests there may never be a final foundation. Every time you demand an ultimate answer, you find the answer folds back into the question. Why does anything exist? Why do rules hold? Why does logic work at all? At the edge of each why, the loop waits. That is why Gödel's work still echoes nearly a century later. Because it is not just about math, it is about the limits of human understanding. The closer you get to certainty, the more you discover the ground you are standing on is actually a circle. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So here we are, a paradox inside mathematics that spilled out into philosophy, into consciousness, into art, into the very way we ask questions. Gödel's strange loop, a system that includes itself, a truth that undoes itself, a ladder that bends back into its own base. The loop that reminds us that maybe there is no final escape from paradox. Maybe paradox is the point. Cause versus correlation. You ever notice how often we connect dots that maybe should not be connected? A friend tells you every time they drink green tea, they feel sharper the next morning. Someone swears their new pair of sneakers makes them run faster. Your brain is wired to link things together, to hunt for cause. But here is the catch. Just because two things move together does not mean one is causing the other. That slippery gap between cause and correlation has fooled science, fooled politics, fooled medicine, and it fools us every single day. At first, it feels harmless. You hear that people who eat more vegetables live longer. So of course you think eating vegetables makes you live longer. But maybe people who eat vegetables also tend to exercise more or smoke less or have better health care. Suddenly what looked like cause is just a shadow of something else. The correlation is real, but the story you told yourself about why might be totally wrong. And this is where the shock comes in. Entire industries, entire belief systems, even entire governments have made colossal mistakes by mixing up correlation and causation. Think about the old studies that showed kids who carried lighters were more likely to smoke. Some people argued that taking away lighters would stop smoking. But the lighter was not the cause. It was just a side effect of the real behavior. Confusing the two is not just silly, it is dangerous. Here is a more chilling example. For decades, researchers noticed a link between hormone replacement therapy and lower risk of heart disease in women. It looked like cause. Doctors prescribed it widely, believing it protected the heart. Later, larger randomized trials revealed the truth. The women taking hormone therapy were already healthier and wealthier than those who were not. And that explained the lower heart disease risk. The therapy itself was not protective. What seemed like a miracle cause was just correlation hiding in plain sight. So why do we keep falling for it? Because our brains crave stories. When you see two things move together, it feels incomplete to leave it unexplained. You want a neat arrow. This leads to that. That leads to this. It feels satisfying, it feels logical, but reality is messier. Sometimes two things happen together because of a hidden third factor. Sometimes it is pure coincidence. Sometimes your own attention tricks you into seeing a pattern that was never really there. And this is not just about statistics. It plays out in your daily life. You bomb a presentation and immediately think it is because you wore that unlucky shirt. You ace an interview and convince yourself it was because you had coffee instead of tea that morning. Your brain loves to draw these lines because it wants control. If you know what causes what, you can change your behavior and shape the future. The loop here is psychological. The need for cause makes you invent it, and the story you invent then shapes your choices, which creates new correlations that seem to confirm the story. Round and round it goes. Here is where the validation lands. It is not your fault. Your mind is built this way. Our ancestors survived by assuming cause. If you ate a berry and got sick, you avoided that berry. If you saw clouds gather and then it rained, you learned to expect the storm. Even if the link was sometimes wrong, erring on the side of cause was safer than waiting for perfect evidence. The loop is evolutionary. Belief in cause creates survival behavior reinforces belief, and humanity moves forward. But the tease is this. In the modern world, the same wiring backfires. We are flooded with data. Millions of numbers, charts, and headlines, all full of correlations. The more information we have, the easier it is to spot patterns and the harder it is to resist turning them into stories about cause. Crime rises when ice cream sales rise. So is ice cream creating criminals? Of course not. They are both linked to heat waves, but unless you look deeper, the wrong cause becomes the truth people cling to. And here is the part that hurts. Even science, the tool we trust to untangle truth, wrestles with this loop. The gold standard for proving cause is the randomized controlled trial. But those are expensive, limited, and sometimes impossible. So researchers lean on observational data, which is riddled with correlations. They try to adjust to account for confounders, but lurking variables always lurk. The more we try to escape the loop, the more we find ourselves circling back inside it. Think about the placebo effect. You take a sugar pill believing it will heal you. Your belief changes your body chemistry. You feel better. Was it the pill that caused the healing? Or was it your mind? Or was it the belief about the pill? The lines blur until cause and correlation fuse together. The loop swallows the distinction, and this is what makes the paradox so sticky. Cause gives us control, correlation gives us clues, but the two are always dancing, always overlapping, always tricking us. You cannot separate them cleanly, and yet you cannot ignore them either, because hidden inside the dance is the truth we desperately need. So here we are, living inside a world of patterns that may or may not mean what we think they mean. We crave certainty, but the loop refuses to let us have it. Cause creates correlation, correlation hints at cause, and the more we chase the difference, the more they fold back into each other, a circle disguised as a straight line. Predator-prey cycles. Out in the wild, there is a rhythm that looks almost like a heartbeat. Predator populations rise, prey populations fall. Prey populations recover, predators rise again. The cycle repeats over and over, a loop written into the laws of nature itself. It looks simple at first, but the more you dig into it, the more it starts to feel like one of the most untamable causal loops we know. Take the lynx and the snowshoe hare, one of the most studied predator-prey pairs in science. For more than a century, researchers noticed their numbers rise and crash in a near-perfect cycle. When hares are abundant, lynx have plenty to eat, so their population booms. But as lynx numbers grow, they consume more hares. The hare population collapses, which leaves the lynx starving, so their population collapses too. With fewer lynx hunting them, the hares rebound, and the whole cycle starts again. It is nature playing out a loop you could almost set your watch to. Here is where the shock hits. These cycles do not just shape individual species. They ripple through entire ecosystems. When hare numbers fall, the plants they eat get a chance to recover. When lynx numbers crash, scavengers like ravens and foxes lose food, which alters their behavior. A single loop between predator and prey creates waves that shift the balance of whole landscapes. And the paradox runs deeper. You might think balance means stability, but predator-prey loops never sit still. They are always in motion, always swinging between extremes. The balance comes not from stillness, but from constant oscillation. Stability is really just a loop that never ends. That defies our human craving for neat equilibrium. We want steady states, but nature hands us cycles. Now, think about what happens when humans step into that loop. For decades, people tried to eliminate predators like wolves to protect livestock and big game. The result was an explosion of prey animals like deer, which overgrazed forests, stripping them bare. Without wolves, the loop broke and the entire system destabilized. Later, when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, the loop came back, and with it came healthier forests, stronger rivers, and even more bird species. The predator-prey cycle is not just about animals eating each other. It is about ecosystems breathing. Here is where the validation lands. This loop is not limited to the wilderness. It mirrors cycles you see in your own life. Stress rises. You cope by eating poorly. Your health dips, which stresses you more, which pushes you further into the same loop. Or think about money and debt. Borrowing boosts spending, which creates growth, which leads to more borrowing, until collapse resets the cycle. Predator-prey dynamics echo in everything from global economies to personal habits. But the tease, the part that unsettles you, is this. These cycles are not just predictable. They are also uncontrollable. You can map them, you can measure them, but stopping them is nearly impossible. Try to stabilize one side, and the other side finds a way to push back. Protect too many prey animals and predators starve. Protect too many predators and prey vanish. The loop resists your interference, almost as if it has a mind of its own. And scientists warn, these loops scale up to climate systems too. Take the oceans. Plankton feed fish, fish feed bigger fish. Populations rise and fall in cycles that affect carbon storage in the sea. Disrupt that balance, and you disrupt the planet's ability to regulate itself. The predator-prey loop might be one of the most powerful engines of stability, and at the same time, one of the most fragile. Here is what makes it so fascinating. The loop never ends with a clear winner. Predators never completely wipe out prey, prey never completely wipe out predators. Each needs the other, even though their relationship is built on destruction. Life feeds on life, and that feeding creates the very conditions for life to continue. Cause and effect fold into each other until you cannot separate them. And when you look at it closely, you start to see a kind of dark beauty. Death feeds life, scarcity feeds abundance, collapse feeds recovery. What looks like chaos is actually rhythm. What feels like violence is actually balance. The predator-prey loop is not an accident of biology. It is the architecture of survival. So here we are. Watching lynx chase hares, wolves chase deer, hawks chase mice, humans chase resources, and realizing it is all the same circle spinning. The predator rises, the prey falls. The prey recovers, the predator rises again. No beginning, no end, just an endless loop of teeth and survival that science can describe but never untangle. Bootstrap Paradox. Imagine. You are walking down the street when a stranger hands you a book filled with brilliant ideas. You study it, you live by it. Maybe you even publish it under your own name. Years later, after a lifetime of teaching others those ideas, you step into a time machine. And in that moment, you realize you are the one who must hand that same book to your younger self. The book has no author, no origin. It exists in a loop. That is the Bootstrap Paradox. At first it feels like a clever puzzle, something a science fiction writer would dream up to mess with your head. But sit with it, and the question becomes unbearable. How can something exist without a clear beginning? The book in this story was never written. The knowledge inside it was never invented. It simply exists because the loop sustains it. Cause and effect fold into each other until the line disappears. And here is where the shock lands. This paradox is not just a thought experiment. Physicists take it seriously. The rules of general relativity, the same equations Einstein wrote down, actually allow for closed time-like curves. That means, in theory, the universe permits paths through time that loop back on themselves. The Bootstrap Paradox is not just fiction. It might be written into the fabric of reality. Think about music. Imagine a traveler goes back and plays Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to Beethoven himself, who then writes it down, believing he composed it. Centuries later, the traveler learns it, takes it back, and plays it again for Beethoven. Who created the symphony? Nobody, or everybody. It exists outside of linear creation. The loop itself is the composer. This is where the validation comes in, because the Bootstrap Paradox is not only about time travel. It exposes how shaky our ideas about beginnings really are. We are obsessed with origins. Who made this? Where did that come from? What was the first spark? But the paradox laughs at the question. The first spark might be an illusion. Maybe what we call beginnings are just points in a circle, and the circle has no start. And the truth is, you already live in little bootstrap loops without realizing it. You learn a word from your parents. They learned it from their parents. Where did the first word come from? You pick up a tradition, a belief, a habit, passed down so long that its origin vanishes. Was it ever invented, or did it just self-perpetuate? The paradox is not just about time machines. It is about culture, memory, even identity. Here is where the tease twists the knife. If the Bootstrap Paradox is real, then originality itself might be a myth. What if some of the greatest discoveries, some of the most profound works of art, some of the most important ideas in history have no true origin? What if they are loops, feeding themselves, endlessly circling through time or through generations? That thought does not just bend your brain, it shakes your sense of meaning. And the loop can get even stranger. Imagine a scientist discovers a formula, sends it back in time, and uses that same formula to inspire their own work. They become trapped in a cycle where the knowledge exists, but its source is gone. There is no inventor, no creator, only repetition. The very fabric of cause and effect seems optional. Logic itself bends, and suddenly you realize that creation may sometimes be a circular act, not a linear one. Because if something can exist without ever being created, then what else in the universe is caught in that loop? Could consciousness itself be a bootstrap paradox? The mind creating the brain that creates the mind. Could the universe itself be one? A cosmos that spawns itself, no beginning, no outside creator, just an endless feedback circle of being. Every time you reach for a clean explanation, the paradox folds you back into the loop. And here is the really unsettling part. The Bootstrap Paradox is immune to resolution. If you say the book had an author, you break the loop. If you say it did not, you deny cause and effect. Either way, you are stuck. Logic cannot untangle it, because the paradox lives in the space where logic itself eats its tail. That is why storytellers love it and scientists fear it. It challenges our most basic assumptions. It mocks our need for origins. It refuses to give us the comfort of a first cause. And yet, it fascinates us because deep down we sense that life itself often works the same way. The past creates the future creates the past, and somewhere in that circle, meaning emerges. So here we are, a paradox where a book writes itself, a song composes itself, an idea invents itself. A circle disguised as a straight line, a phenomenon that defies beginnings and endings, where cause becomes effect and effect becomes cause. The Bootstrap Paradox. Proof that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not the ones with missing pieces, but the ones where the pieces fit perfectly and still leave no beginning. Economic bubbles. You might think you understand money, but economic bubbles prove how little we really do. One day, housing prices are rising steadily, stocks are climbing, cryptocurrencies are making millionaires overnight. Everyone is confident. Everyone believes in the trend. And then, just like that, it all collapses. The same system that made fortunes can turn on itself in a loop that no one can fully control. The crazy part is, bubbles start innocently. People notice something is profitable, maybe a new tech, a new market, a shiny trend. They buy in. Others see them buying in and follow, assuming they know something the first buyers do not. That creates a feedback loop. The more people invest, the higher the prices go, which draws even more investors. Cause and effect start spinning into a self-sustaining cycle. And everyone believes it is normal growth. Then comes the shock. The moment reality intrudes, the loop reverses. A single panic triggers a cascade. Prices drop. Investors rush to sell. The same feedback that made the market soar now makes it crash faster than anyone anticipated. A loop that was feeding greed suddenly feeds fear. And the incredible thing is, it happens over and over again in history. Tulip mania, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 housing crisis. The specifics change, but the loop never does. What makes it worse is that humans are wired to reinforce the cycle. Our brains crave patterns, and we tend to assume trends will continue. We look for confirmation, ignoring signals that contradict the story we want to hear. The bubble feeds on our psychology. The boom convinces us the system is stable. The bust proves just how unstable it was all along. It is a loop we are simultaneously creating and falling victim to. Economists have studied this endlessly, but even with models, predictions are nearly impossible. Every variable interacts with every other in ways that multiply the feedback. People react to other people's reactions. News drives sentiment, sentiment drives action, action changes prices, prices influence news. Round and round it goes. Each loop contains the seeds of its own collapse, yet no one can see them clearly until it is too late. And here is the part that validates the emotional pull. It is not just numbers on a screen. Economic bubbles impact real lives. Jobs are lost, homes are foreclosed, savings disappear. Entire communities can be destabilized. And yet, the loops continue because humans keep making the same mistakes. We are drawn to potential gains, wired to chase opportunity, even when every historical lesson screams caution. The tease is in the illusion of control. During a bubble, everyone believes they are smarter than the market, immune to the loop. Investors, bankers, regulators, all convinced that they see the true value, that they are outside the system. But the bubble does not care about intelligence. It feeds on human behavior, emotions, herd mentality, and greed. And the bigger it grows, the more violent its correction will be. Consider this: bubbles are not isolated events. They ripple through the economy. A collapse in one sector spreads like a virus. The housing market crash can trigger banking failures, which trigger layoffs, which trigger reduced spending, which triggers even more market declines. The loop cascades across society. Cause and effect spiral outward, connecting everything, making the consequences of the feedback much larger than the initial trigger. And yet, these loops can also teach lessons about resilience. After a crash, systems often rebuild, new regulations appear, and behaviors shift. But only temporarily. Human psychology rarely changes fundamentally. The conditions for the next bubble quietly form, even as we focus on recovery. It is a cycle that repeats, a loop that continues, because the system itself allows for it. Bubbles fascinate because they reveal the fragility of what we think of as progress. Growth feels linear, inevitable, and rational. But when you trace it, you see a circle, a feedback loop driven by desire, expectation, and reaction. The system moves in waves, not straight lines. Boom feeds boom, bust feeds bust, and every time we tell ourselves this time is different. So here we are. The next opportunity appears. Investors pile in, prices rise, excitement spreads, and the loop begins again. Cause becomes effect, effect becomes cause, and history marches in circles disguised as forward progress. Economic bubbles are proof that even in systems we believe we control, loops exist that science can describe, psychology can explain, but that no one can fully untangle. Quantum entanglement. Across the tiniest distances and the vastest expanses, particles are whispering secrets to each other in ways that defy everything we think we know about space and time. Change the spin of one particle, and its partner, even if it is light years away, responds instantly. Albert Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, and it is exactly that. Quantum entanglement is a loop that science has observed but still cannot fully explain. At first, it seems like magic. You measure one particle here on Earth, and immediately, its entangled twin somewhere else in the universe knows. It is as if reality itself is folded in on itself, creating a connection that ignores the conventional rules of cause and effect. Speed of light does not matter. Distance does not matter, and yet the correlation persists. The loop is instantaneous and invisible. Here is the shock. Entanglement is not rare or theoretical. Experiments in labs have entangled photons, electrons, even small molecules. Researchers have teleported states across kilometers, proving that these links exist and behave exactly as quantum theory predicts. But if information is transferred instantly, how does the universe prevent contradictions? How does it obey causality? Somehow, the entangled loop exists outside the rules we depend on, and the mystery deepens. Entangled particles remain linked no matter how far they are separated. Scientists have sent particles to satellites orbiting Earth, measuring one on the ground and seeing the twin respond hundreds of kilometers away, and yet nothing travels between them in the traditional sense. No signal, no medium, just correlation that is perfect, precise, and unbreakable. The cause and effect we know collapse into something stranger, simultaneous truth across space. This is where the validation hits. Quantum entanglement is not just an experiment. It underpins reality. Entanglement is essential for quantum computers, which rely on these loops to process information in ways classical computers cannot. It drives secure quantum communication, promising encryption that cannot be hacked because any attempt to observe the entangled system breaks the loop. It is science showing that these loops are not abstract curiosities. They are fundamental to how the universe operates. But here is where the loop gets personal. Think about how this mirrors life. Sometimes knowledge, emotion, or behavior spreads in ways we cannot trace. A thought shared between two people, an instinctive reaction, a memory passed down generations. These are social or biological entanglements. One change in one part resonates elsewhere. Cause and effect loop back on themselves, connections forming in ways that appear instantaneous. The universe is teaching us the same lesson on every scale, and the tease is unsettling. If entanglement allows instantaneous correlation, then what does that say about reality itself? Our space and distance illusions? Is everything connected in a web we cannot perceive? Philosophers, scientists, and mystics have all speculated about hidden layers of connection. But entanglement shows it is not speculation. It is measurable, repeatable, and undeniable. The universe is a network of loops, some visible, some invisible. Here is the paradox that drives scientists mad. Measure one particle, and you affect the other, but you cannot use this to send a message faster than light. The loop exists, but it does not give you control. Cause and effect are entwined, but free will, communication, and observation cannot exploit it. It is a loop we are part of but cannot manipulate directly. The universe remains a trickster, showing us connection without granting mastery. And yet, this makes entanglement one of the most profound discoveries of our time. It suggests the universe is more integrated than we imagined. Reality is not a collection of isolated objects interacting locally. Instead, everything is potentially linked. Everything can influence everything else in ways that defy classical intuition. The loops we see in quantum entanglement may be the building blocks of the loops we see in consciousness, information, and even life itself. So here we are, tiny particles looping across space, instantaneously tied together. A principle that defies distance, challenges causality, and yet obeys the fundamental rules of quantum mechanics. It is a loop that science has mapped, measured, and exploited, and yet still cannot fully untangle. Quantum entanglement reminds us that the universe is not linear, not predictable, and not bound by the common-sense rules we live by every day. Cause and effect fold, twist, and mirror each other, and we are left marveling at the invisible threads connecting everything in ways we are only beginning to grasp. Market reflexivity. Financial markets are alive in ways most people never notice. Prices don't just reflect reality, they shape it. Every rumor, every trade, every expectation loops back into the system, changing the very thing everyone is trying to measure. This is market reflexivity, a causal loop where perception and reality chase each other endlessly, twisting and folding around themselves. And the strangest part is that everyone inside the loop thinks they are acting independently, while the loop is quietly controlling the dance. It starts with belief. A stock begins to rise, maybe because of a solid earnings report, maybe because someone influential tweets about it. Investors see the price going up and think they must be onto something. So they buy. That buying pushes the price higher, which validates the belief. Other investors notice and buy too. Suddenly, perception has created reality. The loop feeds itself. The market seems rational in hindsight, but in real time, it is a self-fulfilling cycle. The shock hits when the loop reverses. Fear spreads faster than fundamentals. Investors start selling, not because the company has failed, but because the perception has shifted. Prices drop. Margin calls trigger more sales. The same feedback mechanism that drove prices up now drives them down, and the crash feels faster and sharper than logic would predict. The market is not linear. It moves in waves of human behavior amplified by the loop. Take a famous example, the dot-com bubble. In the late 1990s, technology stocks were soaring. Investors poured money into companies with no profits, sometimes no products, just the promise of potential. Rising prices validated optimism. Optimism drove prices higher. Reality barely mattered. Then, in 2000, perception shifted. Fear spread, selling accelerated, and trillions of dollars vanished seemingly overnight. The same mechanism that created the boom created the bust. A perfect, reflexive loop. And this isn't limited to tech. Housing markets, cryptocurrencies, even commodity prices follow the same pattern. A sudden belief that something is valuable, coupled with herd behavior, can push markets far beyond fundamental value. Cause becomes effect becomes cause, and participants are trapped in a feedback cycle that is nearly impossible to escape. But market reflexivity doesn't just explain bubbles and crashes. It explains everything about how investors interact with reality. Expectations can affect earnings. High stock prices can allow companies to raise capital, hire talent, and invest in growth, which then drives prices even higher. What started as perception becomes performance. The line between belief and reality blurs. Investors act as if the market is external, but their actions create the very reality they are observing. Even broader, the concept mirrors human psychology. Reflexivity exists wherever feedback loops exist between perception and outcome. Social media trends explode the same way. Political opinion shifts snowball because people respond to others' reactions. Markets are simply the most visible and measurable manifestation of a universal feedback loop. Humans reacting to each other's expectations, creating loops that feed back on themselves. The unsettling part is that reflexivity makes prediction almost impossible. You can analyze data, model trends, and estimate risk, but every action by investors alters the system. Your predictions themselves become part of the loop, influencing behavior in unpredictable ways. The more we try to measure the market, the more we participate in its feedback. There is no objective outside, there is only the loop. Reflexivity also amplifies consequences. The same mechanisms that drive a boom can magnify a bust. Wealth can be created or destroyed rapidly because feedback loops accelerate movement in both directions. Small initial events, like a rumor or a minor policy change, can cascade into massive shifts in wealth and confidence. The system is fragile precisely because it reacts to its own perception. And yet, there is an odd elegance to it. Market reflexivity shows how human belief shapes reality, how perception can become performance. It reminds us that systems with humans are not machines. They are living, breathing, unpredictable. Prices rise because we think they will rise. Prices fall because we fear they will fall. Beliefs and reality intertwine, feeding each other endlessly. The loop is everywhere, and the market is just a mirror, so here we are. Watching trends emerge, watching bubbles form, watching fear and optimism spin the market into highs and lows. Cause and effect no longer feel separate. They fold into each other in a dance of perception, reaction, and feedback. Market reflexivity is proof that even in systems we believe we understand, loops exist that we can describe but never fully control or untangle. And every time we think we are outside the loop quietly reminds us that we are part of it. Placebo loops, Healing is not always about the medicine you take. Sometimes it is about what you believe you are taking. Patients have experienced reduced pain, improved mood, and even measurable physiological changes from a sugar pill, a capsule containing no active drug. This is the placebo effect, but hidden within it is something far more fascinating: the placebo loop, a cycle where belief triggers response, and response strengthens belief, endlessly looping back on itself. It starts with expectation. A patient believes they will feel better. That belief activates neural pathways in the brain that influence perception, emotion, and pain regulation. The brain sends signals to the body, reducing discomfort, releasing endorphins, and modulating stress hormones. The body responds, the patient feels better, and that improvement reinforces the original expectation. Cause and effect fold in on themselves, and the loop becomes self-sustaining. It is not magic, it is biology driven by the mind's belief. The shock is how powerful this loop can be. Placebo responses are observed in serious conditions, not just minor aches or fatigue. In studies of depression, patients receiving placebo treatments sometimes improve nearly as much as those receiving actual medication. Parkinson's patients show measurable changes in dopamine levels. Immune responses can be influenced. The mind literally alters the body's physiology, creating a feedback cycle that turns expectation into reality. Even stranger deception is not necessary. Open-label placebo studies, where patients know they are receiving a placebo, still show significant benefits. Simply participating in a therapeutic ritual, trusting the process, and believing improvement is possible can trigger the loop. The mind does not require trickery to create healing. It thrives on hope, attention, and the belief that it can influence its own state. But there is a darker side: the nocebo effect. Just as positive expectation can trigger improvement, negative expectation can generate real symptoms. Patients who expect side effects, headaches, nausea, fatigue, often experience them even when given a harmless substance. Fear can become physiology. The same causal loop that heals can also harm. Cause and effect are no longer linear. The mind can reinforce both recovery and illness. This is where the loop extends beyond medicine. Placebo mechanisms appear in daily life, shaping performance, motivation, and resilience. Confidence can create results, which build more confidence. Worry can increase stress, which impairs functioning, which increases worry. Beliefs and outcomes fold into one another in loops that amplify themselves. The principles of the placebo loop are everywhere, subtly orchestrating human behavior. Consider how expectation affects sports. An athlete who believes in their training and preparation performs better. That performance reinforces belief, which improves focus and effort in the next session. Even a coach's belief in an athlete can enhance performance by shaping the athlete's perception and motivation. The loop is social as well as internal. Human belief interacts with human behavior to create measurable effects. The placebo loop also highlights how fragile our perception of reality is. If a harmless pill can trigger genuine physiological change, then our understanding of what is real is incomplete. Mind and body are entwined in loops that defy simple cause and effect. Pain, fatigue, motivation, even aspects of immune response are shaped not just by biology, but by expectation and attention. Reality is not as objective as we assume. It is created by the loops we inhabit, and here is the tease that makes it feel almost mystical. Scientists are exploring how to harness these loops ethically. Could rituals, structured expectations, and belief be used to complement medical treatments, reducing reliance on drugs and side effects? Could placebo loops improve mental health, speed recovery, and enhance learning or performance? The possibilities are tantalizing, yet these loops cannot be fully controlled. Human belief is unpredictable, and feedback is sensitive. The loop is powerful, but it is also subtle and fragile. Even the smallest details matter. A doctor's tone of voice, the color of a pill, the ritual of taking it. These all influence the strength of the loop. Our brains are wired to respond to cues, and those cues feed the feedback cycle. The body does not care that the medicine is inert. It responds to the signal of expectation, creating measurable change. In a sense, belief becomes the most potent medicine of all. Placebo loops challenge everything we think we know about causality in medicine and in life. The sequence is no longer linear, take pill, heal. Instead, it is perception, response, reinforcement, perception again. Belief and physiology entwine, generating outcomes that appear spontaneous, but are actually the result of a tightly wound feedback system. Understanding these loops shows us that mind and body cannot be separated. So here we are, living inside countless loops of expectation and response, some small, some profound. The next time someone feels better after taking a sugar pill, or stronger after believing in their own ability, they are participating in one of the most mysterious mechanisms of life. The placebo loop reminds us that reality is malleable, that our minds are not mere observers but active participants, and that the boundaries between cause and effect are far more flexible than they appear. In the end, the placebo loop is not just about medicine. It is about human perception, human expectation, and the power of belief to shape experience. Cause becomes effect, effect reinforces cause, and the cycle continues indefinitely. Understanding it gives insight not just into healing, but into the invisible loops that govern our minds, our bodies, and perhaps even the reality we take for granted. Brain network causality. The brain is not a simple switchboard. It is a tangled web of networks, constantly firing, inhibiting, and amplifying signals. One neuron activates another, which activates another, which loops back. Activity in one region can ripple through the entire system, creating effects in places you would never expect. This is the essence of brain network causality, the way signals, nodes, and circuits interact in loops that generate thought, behavior, and perception. At first, it seems intuitive to think of the brain as linear stimulus, response, thought. But neuroscience has repeatedly shown that causality in the brain is rarely straightforward. Signals loop back, modulate themselves, and interact with other networks in ways that are highly context-dependent. A decision in one area of the brain can influence emotions, memory, and even perception, which in turn loop back and alter future decisions. Cause and effect in the brain is recursive. Here is the shock. Modern imaging techniques like fMRI and EEG reveal that what we experience as a simple thought or feeling is actually the result of thousands of interconnected loops firing across networks simultaneously. The prefrontal cortex communicates with the limbic system, which communicates with sensory areas, which loop back. Attempting to assign a singular cause to behavior often fails, because the effect emerges from multiple interacting loops. And the fascinating part is that these loops are dynamic. The brain constantly reconfigures itself, strengthening some connections, weakening others based on experience, learning, and attention. This means that causality is not static, it is adaptive. A stimulus might trigger one network today, and a slightly different network tomorrow, depending on context and previous activity. The loop is alive, reshaping itself as it runs. Consider memory. When you recall a past event, the act of remembering triggers patterns across multiple networks: sensory, emotional, and conceptual. These activations reinforce or alter the memory itself. Memory is not a static recording, it is a feedback loop influenced by retrieval and by current state. The cause of a remembered detail is partly the original event, partly the networks activated during recall, and partly the way these networks interact in the moment. And it doesn't stop at memory. Decisions, creativity, emotional regulation, and even consciousness emerge from network loops interacting over time. Brain network causality explains why sometimes small stimuli can produce disproportionately large effects. A subtle cue can ripple through networks, influencing perception, emotion, and choice in ways that are not linear but recursive. The brain does not process input and output in a straight line. It folds signals back on themselves, creating loops that generate emergent effects. Here is the validation. Neuroscientists studying neurological disorders have discovered that disruptions in network loops can have cascading effects. Epileptic seizures, for instance, occur when one loop overactivates and spreads across networks uncontrollably. Mood disorders like depression or anxiety often involve dysregulated loops in emotional networks, causing self-reinforcing negative patterns. Understanding causality as network loops allows researchers to see not just isolated areas of dysfunction, but the interactions that produce symptoms. And here is the tease. If our thoughts, behaviors, and even identities emerge from loops in brain networks, then free will, creativity, and personality are also products of complex causal interactions. The brain is a universe unto itself, full of feedback, self-modulation, and emergent properties. Understanding it requires thinking in loops, not straight lines, and accepting that causality in the brain is distributed, recursive, and often unpredictable. Even interventions like therapy or learning operate on these loops. Cognitive behavioral therapy works because it rewires loops, introducing new patterns of interaction between thought, emotion, and behavior. Learning strengthens networks and creates new loops, enabling skills and memory. Every intervention is essentially an attempt to guide causality within loops, nudging the system toward desired outcomes. And the implications extend beyond individual brains. Social interaction itself can form loops between brains. Communication, mimicry, and empathy are networks interacting across people, creating feedback that shapes perception, emotion, and behavior. The causal loops inside a brain are influenced by loops between brains, making cognition both an individual and collective phenomenon. So here we are. Brain network causality reminds us that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are not isolated events. They emerge from loops, from interactions between nodes and networks, modulating and reinforcing each other across time. Cause and effect are intertwined, folding back on themselves in a dynamic web. The loops are invisible, yet they determine who we are, how we think, and how we experience the world. In the end, understanding these loops offers insight into everything from mental health to learning to social behavior. The brain is not a linear machine. It is a looping network of cause and effect, constantly reshaping itself, producing outcomes that are more than the sum of their parts. And every thought, every action, every perception is part of a causal dance that folds back on itself, looping endlessly, quietly, invisibly. Free will paradox. We like to think we make choices, that each decision, from what to eat for breakfast to whether to quit a job, comes from a conscious, autonomous self. But the free will paradox challenges that belief. It asks a simple yet unsettling question: Are our choices truly ours, or are they predetermined by prior causes we cannot control? And the deeper you dig, the less clear the answer becomes. Neuroscience gives a shock right away. Experiments have shown that brain activity predicting a decision occurs hundreds of milliseconds before a person becomes consciously aware of making that choice. Your brain has already started the process before your conscious mind decides. That suggests our sense of control might be a story we tell ourselves after the fact, a narrative to explain decisions that have already been set in motion by underlying neural loops. But the paradox is not just science, it is also logic and philosophy. If all events have causes, then every decision is determined by prior states of the world. Even if you feel free, your choice is entangled in a causal chain extending back to your upbringing, your genetics, your environment. Free will seems to slip through your fingers, replaced by deterministic loops of cause and effect. Yet we experience agency. We deliberate, we hesitate, we plan. The paradox is that both these truths feel undeniable, our choices feel free, and yet they are constrained. Here is where the loop becomes interesting. Conscious awareness does not stop the causal chain, it interacts with it. We can reflect on our impulses, redirect behavior, and reinforce patterns. Will itself becomes part of a feedback loop. Desire triggers action, action influences outcome, outcome influences future desire. Cause and effect fold back on each other, and free will, if it exists, may be less about absolute independence and more about being a participant in loops that guide and shape behavior. Think about moral responsibility. Society treats people as accountable for their actions, assuming free will exists. But if choices are determined by prior causes, the foundation of responsibility feels shaky. Yet without some sense of agency, we could not structure ethics, law, or social norms. The paradox deepens. Free will may be a necessary illusion, a loop we participate in to make civilization possible. Our sense of choice shapes behavior, which shapes consequences, which reinforces our sense of choice. And it gets stranger. Some philosophers propose compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. Even if choices arise from causal chains, our conscious deliberation can influence the chains. Awareness of cause can feed back into behavior, creating new loops that redirect outcomes. The very act of reflecting on freedom can influence the causal system, making freedom both limited and emergent. Here is the validation. Studies of self-control, habit formation, and cognitive training show that deliberate effort can reshape neural patterns. The loops of behavior are plastic. Willpower, practice, and reflection all feed back on brain networks, altering the probabilities of future choices. Free will may not be absolute, but it exists as a dynamic, recursive influence within deterministic structures. It is a loop of potential and constraint, not a straight line of independence. The tease is in the uncertainty. If free will is emergent from loops of cause and effect, then every decision is both determined and undetermined. The paradox creates a space where prediction is limited, but influence is real. You may not be fully free, but your actions still matter. You may be influenced by past causes, but your deliberation becomes part of the next causal cycle. The loop never stops. Even small decisions highlight the paradox. Choosing to exercise, to speak up, to forgive, or to take a risk are all influenced by prior states, but each choice can trigger new loops, new patterns, new behaviors. The paradox is recursive. Your sense of freedom feeds back into the loops that constrain it, giving the experience of agency while remaining entangled in causality. and the implications extend beyond the individual. Collective human behavior, the choices of communities, nations, and societies, follows similar loops. Cultural norms, economic incentives, and social pressures influence individual decisions, while those decisions feed back into culture. The loops of free will operate on personal and collective levels, creating patterns that are emergent, adaptive, and unpredictable. So here we are. The free will paradox does not provide easy answers. It does not tell us whether we are truly free or fully determined. But it shows that choice exists in a loop: desire, action, reflection, feedback. Each cycle shapes the next, and the experience of freedom may emerge precisely from our participation in these loops. Cause and effect, constraint and influence, freedom and determinism fold back on themselves, creating the very sense of agency we live by. In the end, the paradox is both humbling and empowering. It reminds us that we are neither fully masters of fate nor entirely passive. We inhabit loops, influence them, and are influenced in turn. Free will, if it exists, is not a straight line. It is a dance of cause, effect, and conscious participation, and understanding this loop may be the closest we get to understanding what it means to truly make a choice. Social media feedback. Open your phone, scroll for a few minutes, and you are inside one of the most powerful loops of our time. Social media does not just show you content. It responds to you, learns from you, and then shapes what you see next. Every like, comment, or pause creates data. That data feeds algorithms. Those algorithms adjust the feed, influencing your behavior, which generates more data. This is the social media feedback loop, and once you are in it, it is almost impossible to step out. At first, it seems harmless. You click a funny video, you get more funny videos. You follow a news story, you see more updates. The platform adapts to your interests, personalizing your feed. But personalization is not neutral. It is a loop designed to keep you engaged. Your behavior shapes the algorithm, and the algorithm shapes your behavior. What you see feels like choice, but much of it is the product of feedback quietly sculpting your attention. Here is the shock. These loops do not just reflect preferences, they amplify them. Watch one extreme opinion video, and the algorithm shows you more of the same. Read a conspiracy theory, and suddenly your feed is full of evidence. The loop creates echo chambers, reinforcing beliefs and intensifying emotions. What begins as curiosity spirals into conviction, not because the world has changed, but because the feedback loop has reshaped your perception of it. And the effects are measurable. Psychologists studying social media have found that repeated exposure to similar viewpoints increases polarization. People become more extreme, less tolerant of opposing views, and more convinced of their own correctness. This is not coincidence. It is the loop at work. Your clicks feed the algorithm feeds your identity, and your identity feeds back into your clicks. Cause and effect blur into a cycle of reinforcement. The validation is easy to see in behavior. Social media does not just influence what we think, it influences how we feel. Dopamine hits from likes and shares create reward loops in the brain. Post something, get a notification, feel validated. That validation encourages more posting. The cycle continues, and soon the loop is not about communication. It is about constant reinforcement of self-worth through digital signals. Your brain chemistry becomes entangled with the algorithm, and the loop goes deeper. Companies, influencers, and even political groups exploit these cycles. They know outrage spreads faster than calm, so they design content that provokes anger, fear, or excitement. That emotion drives engagement, which strengthens the loop. Social media platforms reward what keeps users scrolling, not what informs or enlightens them. The feedback loop optimizes for attention, and attention is not neutral. It bends toward the extreme. Think about how trends emerge. A single video goes viral, picked up by the algorithm, amplified by users, and suddenly millions are participating in the same dance, meme, or challenge. The loop magnifies tiny sparks into global phenomena. It feels organic, but it is algorithmic feedback accelerating human imitation. Virality is not just luck, it is the product of carefully tuned loops that thrive on replication. But here is the tease. These loops are not just external, they rewire us internally. Attention spans shrink, memory changes, and even self-image shifts in response to online feedback. A teenager who posts a photo and receives positive reactions feels validated, reinforcing both the behavior and the identity tied to it. A negative response can trigger shame, anxiety, or withdrawal. The feedback loop becomes inseparable from self-perception. The boundary between person and platform dissolves. And yet, the loop is not purely negative. Social media can spread awareness, build communities, and amplify voices that would otherwise go unheard. Movements grow through feedback loops that connect individuals around the world. Hope and solidarity can spread as fast as outrage. The loop is neutral in design. It is our participation that determines what it amplifies. But neutrality does not make it harmless. Once inside, every choice we make is shaped by choices the loop already made for us. This raises unsettling questions. If algorithms predict and guide our behavior, how much of what we believe is truly ours? Are we making decisions, or are we simply reacting to loops engineered to hold our attention? The feedback system feels invisible, yet it is constantly influencing. The more we participate, the deeper the loop pulls us in, shaping thought, emotion, and behavior at every level. So here we are, living in an era where reality itself is filtered through feedback loops. Social media is not a mirror of the world. It is a magnifier, a distorting lens, a recursive system that learns from us and then teaches us who we are. The loop does not end when you log off, because the patterns it creates linger in thought, belief, and identity. It is not just entertainment. It is a causal loop that science, psychology, and society still cannot fully untangle. Chaos attractors. Sometimes the most unpredictable systems settle into patterns that feel almost inevitable. A butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, a storm forms in Texas, and yet weather forecasters notice repeating structures, swirling paths that seem drawn to invisible shapes. These hidden structures are called chaos attractors, and they reveal one of the strangest loops in science, order hiding inside chaos. At first glance, chaos theory looks like randomness. A tiny change in initial conditions leads to wildly different outcomes. One decimal place in the wrong spot, and the system veers off in an entirely new direction. That is why weather forecasts lose accuracy after a week. The equations are deterministic, but the sensitivity to small changes makes prediction nearly impossible. But here is the twist. Within all that unpredictability, patterns emerge. The Lorentz attractor is the most famous example. A simple set of three equations modeling airflow produced swirling, butterfly-shaped loops on a graph. No two paths through the attractor are identical, yet they all fall into the same strange shape. The system never repeats exactly, but it also never escapes the structure. It is as if chaos itself is being pulled into an invisible pattern, orbiting endlessly without repeating or settling. Here is the shock. Chaos attractors are not just mathematical curiosities, They show up everywhere. In heart rhythms, in ecosystems, in financial markets. Doctors analyzing arrhythmias have found patterns that resemble strange attractors, revealing when a heart is spiraling toward danger. Ecologists studying predator-prey populations see cycles that seem chaotic yet orbit hidden structures. Investors watching stock markets feel randomness, but underlying cycles suggest attractors at play. Systems we call unpredictable are often guided by invisible loops that attract their behavior, and the implications go even further. These attractors demonstrate that chaos is not the absence of order. It is order at a deeper level. You cannot predict the exact path, but you can predict the boundaries of behavior. The system will wander, but it will wander within the attractor. This paradox, that unpredictability still follows rules, reshapes how we understand complexity. The loop is both wild and constrained at the same time. The validation comes when you realize this applies to human behavior too. Take moods, habits, even relationships. At times they feel unpredictable, yet people often cycle back into familiar patterns. Someone might resolve to change, break a routine for a while, but slowly orbit back into the same loop. The attractor is not physical, but psychological, pulling behavior back into a recurring structure. Our lives often have strange attractors, repeated dynamics that shape us even when we try to escape. Chaos attractors also challenge how we see control. If a system is sensitive to small changes but still drawn toward an attractor, then influence is possible but limited. You can nudge the trajectory, shift the timing, alter the path, but you cannot fully escape the deeper structure without redesigning the system itself. This is why interventions in ecosystems, economies, or even habits often fail. The loop pulls behavior back toward the attractor. The system resists total control, and here is the tease. What if consciousness itself is orbiting an attractor? Some neuroscientists speculate that brain activity, though chaotic in detail, may be constrained by strange attractors that allow for stable perception and thought. Dreams, creativity, even personality could be the wandering paths of neural chaos held within invisible attractors. If true, then the unpredictability of mind is not random. It is structured chaos, an emergent order that keeps us from dissolving into noise. Think about how this reshapes our view of freedom. On the surface, life feels open, unpredictable, full of possibilities, yet deep patterns, biological, psychological, cultural, pull us into recurring loops. We act freely, but within boundaries shaped by hidden attractors. The paradox is that chaos and structure coexist, freedom and constraint dance together, and loops guide outcomes in ways we can sense but not fully predict. So here we are, staring into the strange beauty of chaos attractors. They remind us that unpredictability does not mean disorder. It means deeper loops are at work, pulling the system into shapes we cannot escape. In weather, in markets, in biology, and even in our own lives, chaos is not pure noise. It is a hidden rhythm, a looping dance around invisible attractors. And once you see the pattern, you realize that chaos itself may be the most ordered thing of all. Observer effect. The very act of watching something can change what you are watching. That is the observer effect. And once you see it, you realize it shows up everywhere, from the smallest particles in physics to the way people behave when they know they are being noticed. It is not just a scientific oddity, it is a loop where observation and reality feed into each other, blurring the line between cause and effect. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect is legendary. Particles like electrons do not behave like tiny billiard balls. They exist in a cloud of probabilities, wave-like patterns of where they might be. But when you measure one, the wave collapses into a definite state. Before the measurement, the electron is spread out across possibilities. After the measurement, it has a fixed position or momentum. The act of observing changes the outcome. You cannot separate the result from the fact that you looked at it. Here is the shock. This is not just theory. Experiments with the famous double-slit setup prove it. Fire particles through two slits, and they create an interference pattern, as if each particle acts like a wave going through both slits at once. But place a detector to see which slit the particle actually passes through, and the interference disappears. The particle behaves like a solid object instead. Observation alters reality. The loop between measuring and outcome is inescapable. And this strangeness is not confined to physics. In daily life, people behave differently when they know they are observed. A student writes more carefully if the teacher is watching. An employee works harder when the manager walks by. Even self-awareness, the act of noticing yourself, can shift behavior. Observation loops back into the system, changing what it observes. Psychologists have studied this effect for decades. One example is the Hawthorne studies, where researchers found that simply paying attention to workers increased their productivity, regardless of what changes were made to the environment. The loop was not about lighting or hours. It was about being observed. The awareness of scrutiny shaped behavior, which then validated the observation, reinforcing the loop. Here is the validation. You live this every day. Think about how you act when recording a video, posting on social media, or even looking at yourself in a mirror. The act of observation, even self-observation, changes what you do. It makes you stand straighter, choose words differently, manage expressions. The observer effect is not an abstract concept. It is a loop woven into human life. And the tease is what it means for reality itself. If particles behave differently when observed, and people behave differently when noticed, then what is the true state of things when no one is watching? Does reality exist independently, or is it always entangled with observation? The observer effect suggests that measurement, attention, and awareness are not passive. They are active forces that change the system they touch. Even science itself is tangled in this loop. Every experiment influences the outcome by the way it is measured. Instruments cannot escape interaction with what they measure. And at the human level, expectations shape results. Placebo effects, confirmation bias, and self-fulfilling prophecies are all examples of observation influencing reality. To measure is to participate. To observe is to alter. This raises profound questions about consciousness. If observation changes quantum events, and consciousness is itself built from quantum processes at some level, could the mind be part of the loop that collapses possibilities into reality? Some physicists resist this idea, others entertain it. But the paradox remains: awareness and reality may not be separate. They may be two sides of the same loop. So here we are, faced with a mystery that cuts across science, psychology, and philosophy. The observer effect is not just about looking. It is about loops of influence. To see something is to change it. To measure is to shape. To pay attention is to alter the very thing you notice. Reality is not a fixed backdrop. It is dynamic, shifting under the gaze of observers who can never truly stand outside the system. In the end, the observer effect reminds us that we are not detached spectators of reality. We are participants in a loop that connects seeing and being, measurement and outcome, awareness and existence. And once you understand that loop, you begin to realize that nothing is ever untouched by the fact that it is observed. First cause problem. Every effect seems to have a cause. You are here because your parents made choices, because their parents made choices, because generations before them made choices. Trace any event backwards, and it leads to something else. The glass shatters because it was dropped. It was dropped because someone lost their grip. They lost their grip because of a distraction. The distraction was caused by a sound. Cause leads to cause endlessly. And then comes the question that has haunted philosophy and science alike: what started it all? That is the first cause problem. The logic feels simple at first. If every event has a cause, then following the chain back should eventually reveal a beginning. But the moment you try, you hit a wall. If something caused the universe, what caused that something? If God, energy, or some primal spark set everything in motion, then where did that spark come from? The loop seems impossible to escape. Every answer demands another answer. Here is the shock. Some philosophers argue that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. They claim there must be a first mover, an uncaused cause that started the chain without itself being caused. Ancient thinkers like Aristotle framed it this way, and theologians later built entire arguments for the existence of God on the concept. But physics complicates the story. Modern cosmology points to the Big Bang as the beginning of space, time, and causality itself. If time began at the Big Bang, then asking what came before may not even make sense. The cause could be beyond time itself. Yet science offers other unsettling possibilities. Quantum mechanics shows events that appear to happen without definite causes. Particles pop into and out of existence in quantum fields. Radioactive atoms decay at unpredictable times, with no clear trigger. If the universe operates at a quantum level, perhaps the first event did not need a cause at all. Perhaps existence itself emerged from quantum fluctuations, from nothingness, or from a state beyond our categories of cause and effect. And still the loop pulls us back. If quantum laws allowed the universe to emerge, where did those laws come from? Why do the rules exist at all? It is like being trapped in a hall of mirrors. Every explanation reflects another question, which reflects another, and there is no clear exit. Here is the validation. Everyone has felt this question at some point, staring at the night sky or lying awake at night. Where did all this come from? Why is there something instead of nothing? And whatever you believe, whether a divine cause, a scientific mechanism, or an eternal cycle, you cannot escape the paradox. Something must explain existence, but every explanation seems to push the problem back one more step. Some thinkers resolve this by embracing loops directly. They suggest the universe is cyclical, endlessly expanding and contracting, with no true beginning. In that view, the first cause problem dissolves because there is no first moment, only eternal recurrence. Others propose multiverse theories, where our universe is one bubble among countless others, each with its own beginnings. But even then, the question remains: what caused the multiverse? And here is the tease. The first cause problem may not be a puzzle we can solve from inside the system. Our brains evolved to understand chains of events within time, but the origin of time itself may lie outside that framework. It might be that asking what came before the beginning is like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question collapses under its own assumptions. Yet the mystery compels us, because cause and effect are the way we make sense of everything. To run into their limit is to run into the edge of thought itself. the problem also touches how we live. If everything has a cause, then so do our choices, our beliefs, our identities. Are we free, or are we just ripples in a causal chain stretching back to the start of time? The first cause is not only about the universe, it is about us. If the chain has no origin, then perhaps we are trapped in endless loops of cause. If it does have an origin, then perhaps everything, including our decisions, was set in motion long ago. Either way, freedom becomes entangled in the paradox. So here we are, staring at a question with no clean answer. If there is a first cause, it must be unlike anything else we know, uncaused and beyond explanation. If there is no first cause, then the universe is an infinite loop, with no true beginning. Both options feel impossible, and yet one must be true. The first cause problem is not just a riddle, it is the deepest loop of all, the question that folds back on itself, defying resolution, demanding wonder. AI feedback collapse. Artificial intelligence learns from data, and that sounds straightforward until you realize most of the data comes from us. Our words, our clicks, our art, our choices, all poured into massive models that then turn around and feed us new content. But here is the twist: the more we use AI, the more AI starts learning from itself. And when that happens, the system can spiral into what researchers call AI feedback collapse. At first, the loop feels harmless. AI generates a paragraph, a drawing, or a prediction. That output circulates online, mixed with human-created work. The next time the AI trains, it ingests that data too. But the AI does not know what is original and what is recycled. It just processes patterns. Over time, if too much of the training material is AI made, the model's outputs begin to fold back on themselves. Subtle errors multiply. The system starts reinforcing its own mistakes, spiraling into noise. Here is the shock. Researchers have already tested this. When AI systems were retrained repeatedly on their own outputs, their performance degraded rapidly. Text became repetitive, images warped, numbers drifted toward nonsense. The collapse was not slow, it accelerated. Once feedback loops dominated the data, the models stopped producing meaningful variety and began generating distorted echoes of their own errors. The machine essentially consumed itself. This is not just a technical glitch, it is a loop of cause and effect. AI creates outputs, those outputs reshape the dataset reshapes the AI, and the cycle continues until quality collapses. It is like making a photocopy of a photocopy. Each round loses clarity until all that remains is a blur. The paradox is that AI, designed to learn from everything, becomes weaker the more it learns from itself. But here is where it gets even more unsettling. We rely on AI to filter, recommend, and generate content across nearly every digital platform. If more and more of what we see online is AI generated, then the feedback loop between humans and machines tightens. AI shapes what we read and watch, which shapes what we create, which shapes what AI ingests again. The collapse is not only technical, it is cultural. Human imagination risks orbiting around AI's recycled loops, and the validation hits close to home. Think about recommendation engines already guiding your choices. The more you watch one type of video, the more the algorithm shows you the same thing. Soon your feed narrows, repeating patterns until it feels like there is nothing else. That is a small-scale feedback collapse. Diversity shrinks, novelty disappears, and the system becomes an echo chamber. AI feedback collapse is this effect multiplied across every domain: art, science, information, even identity. The tease is what happens next. Do we end up with a digital world where creativity slowly flattens, originality disappears, and everything starts to look the same? Or do we find ways to break the loop, injecting fresh data, designing safeguards, ensuring human contribution remains at the center? The outcome is not just about AI performance, it is about the future of culture, knowledge, and innovation. Some researchers propose methods to prevent collapse, like filtering out AI outputs from training data or constantly refreshing models with raw, unprocessed human input. But those solutions depend on a steady supply of original work. That raises an uncomfortable question: will AI's growth depend on human creativity, even more than we think? The loop may not replace us. It may trap us into constantly feeding it just to keep it alive. And there is another dimension. Feedback collapse does not only threaten quality, it threatens trust. If people cannot tell where data came from, whether a fact was sourced from reality or recycled from AI hallucination, the foundation of knowledge itself begins to wobble. Collapse here is not just a technical breakdown, it is an epistemic one. What we know becomes entangled in loops of synthetic repetition, making truth harder to separate from echo. So here we are, standing at the edge of an unfolding feedback loop that could define the future of intelligence itself. AI is not a neutral tool, it is a recursive system learning from its environment, and now its environment increasingly includes itself. Collapse is not inevitable, but the risk grows with every generated word, image, and prediction fed back into the machine. The paradox is clear. The smarter AI gets, the more tempting it is to rely on its outputs. But the more we rely on those outputs, the more fragile the system becomes. Too much self-reference, and intelligence collapses into noise. Too little, and progress slows. Navigating this loop may be the greatest challenge of our technological age, because the stakes are not just about machines. They are about how humans and machines co-evolve in a shared feedback system. In the end, AI feedback collapse is a warning. Loops can empower, but they can also consume. If we do not understand and guide them, the systems we build may spiral inward, losing coherence, dragging our culture with them. The loop between human and machine is only beginning, and its outcome depends on whether we can keep the flow of originality alive. Nuclear chain loops. Inside every atom is a hidden storm. Neutrons, protons, and forces so powerful that they hold matter together at its core. But under the right conditions, that stability shatters, and what happens next is one of the most dramatic feedback loops in nature, the nuclear chain reaction. This is not just physics. It is a loop of cause and effect so explosive that it can power entire cities or level them in seconds. It starts with a single neutron colliding with a heavy nucleus, like uranium-235 or plutonium-239. That impact destabilizes the nucleus, causing it to split in two smaller nuclei, releasing energy and more neutrons. Those neutrons fly out and hit other nuclei, which split and release even more neutrons. The process loops back on itself, multiplying with each step. One event triggers the next, and soon the reaction is no longer linear. It is exponential. Here is the shock. If each split produces just enough neutrons to cause more splits, the reaction sustains itself. That is critical mass. Below it, the loop fizzles out. Above it, the loop grows uncontrollably, producing a chain reaction that can unleash unimaginable energy. This is the same principle behind both nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. The loop is identical, but the context determines whether it lights homes or destroys cities. The sheer scale is staggering. In nuclear fission, less than 1% of the mass of the fuel is converted into energy. Yet that tiny fraction is enough to produce explosions millions of times more powerful than chemical reactions. A handful of uranium, if fully fissioned, could release as much energy as thousands of tons of conventional explosives. The loop between neutrons and nuclei is unimaginably efficient, folding back on itself until the system becomes a runaway cascade. And here is where the paradox emerges. Humans have tried to tame this loop. In a nuclear power plant, control rods absorb excess neutrons, carefully balancing the reaction. The goal is steady feedback, not too little, not too much. But if control is lost, the loop tips toward disaster, as in Chernobyl or Fukushima, where runaway feedback created catastrophic outcomes. The same self-sustaining loop that lights cities can, under different conditions, bring them to ruin. The validation comes when you see how nuclear chain loops mirror patterns across life. Think about information spreading online, where one post spawns shares, which spawn more shares, until the message becomes viral, or disease transmission, where one infected person spreads to several others, who spread to more. Each of these is a nuclear-like loop, small beginnings spiraling into massive outcomes. What makes nuclear loops unique is their sheer physical intensity, compressing time and scale into unimaginable force. And the tease is deeper than energy or destruction. At the heart of the nuclear loop is a glimpse of the cosmos itself. The energy released in fission is the same energy that powers stars through fusion. Every atom of gold or uranium on Earth was forged in ancient cosmic chain reactions, in the cores of stars and the explosions of supernovae. The loops we struggle to control are the same loops that created the elements of our world. The nuclear chain loop also forces us to confront responsibility. Once unleashed, these reactions cannot be undone. The first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was not just an explosion. It was a demonstration of a feedback loop-turned weapon. Since then, humanity has lived in the shadow of the loop, balancing deterrence and annihilation, energy and destruction. The loop is not abstract. It is existential, a reminder of how feedback can magnify human decisions to global consequences. And yet, there is hope in this loop too. Controlled nuclear reactions offer nearly limitless clean energy, a way to power civilization without choking the atmosphere with carbon. Fusion, the process that powers the sun, is the holy grail. An even more powerful loop where light nuclei merge instead of splitting. Scientists are still chasing it, building massive reactors like ITER, trying to create a self-sustaining fusion loop that burns like a star on Earth. If successful, it would be the most profound example of a feedback loop turned to humanity's benefit. So here we are, staring at the nuclear chain loop with awe and fear. A neutron hits a nucleus, the nucleus splits, more neutrons fly, and the cycle accelerates, folding back on itself until it either sustains life or threatens it. It is the purest expression of a causal loop, tiny triggers cascading into vast outcomes, power beyond imagination resting on the razor's edge of control. In the end, nuclear chain loops remind us that feedback is not just abstract philosophy. It is the heartbeat of the universe, written into the atoms that make us, the stars that light us, and the choices that define us. The loop can destroy, or it can sustain. The question is not whether the loop exists. It is whether we can live wisely within its fire. Escher-Bach Loops. Take a step into the art of M.C. Escher. Stairs that rise only to fall, hands drawing each other into existence, birds transforming into fish mid-flight. Every image is a loop, folding back on itself, breaking logic yet somehow making sense. Now pair that with Johann Sebastian Bach, whose fugues spin musical phrases that repeat, twist, invert, and return until the end feels like a beginning and the beginning like an end. And finally, add the mind-bending ideas of Douglas Hofstadter, who looked at both art and music and saw a deeper truth, strange loops that hint at the structure of consciousness itself. This is the world of Escher-Bach Loops. They are not just clever illusions or musical tricks. They are demonstrations of recursion, the way patterns repeat across levels, self-referencing until the line between layers blurs. Look at Escher's drawing hands. One hand sketches the other into existence, and you cannot say which came first. Listen to Bach's fugues, and you hear melodies that echo themselves in higher and lower registers, weaving back until the music seems to chase its own tail. These are not tricks of creativity alone. They are windows into how systems, whether art, music, or minds, can fold back on themselves to create meaning. Here is the shock. Hofstadter argued in his book Gödel, Escher backs that consciousness itself may be one of these strange loops. The brain, he suggested, is not just a machine firing neurons. It is a self-referential system, a pattern that points back at itself until emerges. In other words, your sense of being you may be the mental equivalent of Escher's impossible staircase or Bach's recursive fugue. A loop so rich it becomes self-aware. Think about what that implies. We tend to imagine the mind as something separate, a soul floating above the mechanics of the brain. But what if you are nothing more than a recursive loop, neurons processing information in such a way that the system turns inward and recognizes itself? Like a mirror reflecting a mirror, the brain creates a hall of reflections, and somewhere in that infinite regression, the experience of self arises. That is not just philosophy. It is neuroscience tangled with art and mathematics, and the validation is that we see these loops everywhere once we start looking. Computer programs that call themselves to perform tasks, genetic code that folds into feedback mechanisms regulating itself, even language, where words can describe themselves. This sentence is an example of itself. Our world is woven with Escher-Bach loops, from the biological to the symbolic. They are the engine of creativity and paradox, the place where complexity blooms. But here is the tease. What happens if Hofstadter is right and consciousness is itself a strange loop? That would mean the mystery of mind is not solved by pointing to a soul or a spark, but by recognizing a system complex enough to bend back on itself. It would mean identity, memory, even free will might be recursive structures, illusions created by loops so convincing that they feel real. And yet, does calling them illusions make them any less real? If your self is a loop, it is still you. The loop does not diminish existence, it creates it. Escher-Bach loops also force us to reconsider the boundary between art, math, and science. Escher drew impossible staircases not because he set out to explain recursion, but because he wanted to explore visual paradox. Bach wrote fugues not because he sought to demonstrate self-reference, but because he followed beauty wherever it led. And yet, both revealed truths that mathematics and philosophy later echoed. Loops are not just logical structures. They are aesthetic experiences. They feel satisfying, haunting, or infinite because something in us recognizes the pattern as fundamental. And there is one more layer. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which inspired Hofstadter, is itself a strange loop. Gödel showed that in any mathematical system, there are truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. He did this by crafting a statement that essentially says, this statement cannot be proven. The system turns inward, referencing itself, and in doing so reveals its own limits. Escher drew it, Bach composed it, and Gödel proved it. 3 different languages, 1 universal loop. So where does that leave us? Perhaps in the most fascinating position of all. To understand strange loops is to glimpse the possibility that existence itself is recursive. That meaning is born when systems fold back on themselves. That the mystery of being alive may not be hidden in something beyond the physical, but in the looping structure of the physical itself. Escher-Bach loops are not just curiosities. They are reminders that the deepest truths are not linear. They are circular, self-referential, paradoxical. They tease us with impossibility, yet feel undeniably real. The staircase that climbs forever, the melody that ends by returning to its beginning, the mind that perceives itself perceiving, all are echoes of the same strange loop, and in those echoes, perhaps, is the very sound of consciousness. Metabolic hunger cycle. Hunger feels so simple. Your stomach growls, you grab some food, and the problem disappears. But underneath that sensation is one of the most intricate loops in biology. The metabolic hunger cycle. It is not just about food. It is about survival, emotion, and energy, a loop so powerful that it can drive every decision you make, from how you eat to how you live. The cycle begins with a dip in blood sugar. Cells need glucose to function, and when levels fall, your body panics. Hormones like ghrelin rise, sending urgent signals to the brain. That growl in your stomach is only the surface layer. What is really happening is a biochemical alarm system telling you energy is running low. The brain interprets the signal not just as hunger, but as a deep, primal need. You are not simply craving food. You are craving survival. Here comes the shock. The moment you eat, the cycle does not end, it resets. Food breaks down into glucose, fats, and amino acids. Blood sugar spikes. Insulin surges to shuttle nutrients into cells. For a short while, you feel satisfied. But as insulin lowers blood sugar again, the cycle circles back, and hunger begins to whisper once more. It is not a straight line, it is a feedback loop that never stops. A cycle that has been running in every living human since the dawn of our species. And here is the twist. Modern life has hacked this loop in ways evolution never anticipated. Highly processed foods flood your system with sugar so quickly that insulin overcorrects, dropping your blood sugar lower than before. That crash makes you hungrier, even though you just ate. The loop accelerates, trapping you in a cycle of craving, eating, crashing, and craving again. Millions of people live caught in this metabolic whirlpool without realizing it is not willpower failing them. It is biology turning against them. The validation is that everyone has felt this. You eat a fast food meal or grab a pastry, and an hour later, you feel sluggish and hungrier than when you started. That is the hunger cycle tightening its grip. The body evolved to hunt, gather, and feast occasionally. Instead, it now lives surrounded by abundance, tricked into chasing short bursts of energy over and over. What once kept us alive in scarcity now chains us in plenty. But the cycle is not just physical. It is psychological. Ghrelin does more than make you hungry. It affects mood, learning, even motivation. Hunger sharpens attention because, for our ancestors, missing a meal meant finding one fast. That same hormone today can make you irritable, distracted, or restless. Then when you eat, dopamine rewards the act, reinforcing the behavior. Food is not just fuel. It is a feedback loop linking biology with emotion. The mind and body are not separate players here. They are parts of the same cycle. Here is the tease. What if the hunger cycle is not only a biological trap, but also a key to transformation? Fasting, for example, disrupts the loop. When the body runs out of quick glucose, it shifts to burning fat and producing ketones, creating a different rhythm of energy. Some studies suggest this state sharpens cognition, reduces inflammation, even extends lifespan. In other words, breaking the loop deliberately may unlock benefits the constant cycle of eating never allows. But this is the paradox. You cannot escape the hunger cycle entirely. To live is to eat, and to eat is to reset the loop. The goal is not to break it, but to balance it, to prevent the loop from spinning out of control. That is why nutritionists emphasize whole foods, fiber, and protein. They slow the absorption of glucose, stretching the loop into a steadier rhythm. It is not about avoiding hunger, but about learning how to live with it. There is also a cultural side to this loop. Entire industries are built on manipulating hunger, from snack foods engineered to bypass satiety signals to marketing campaigns designed to spark cravings. The hunger cycle is not just a private experience. It is a battleground where biology, psychology, and commerce collide. Every craving you feel has roots in your body, but it is also amplified by systems that profit when the loop spins faster. And yet, hunger is not the enemy. Without it, you would not survive a single day. The metabolic hunger cycle is one of the oldest feedback systems in life itself, shaping human history as much as any invention or discovery. It drove migrations, fueled agriculture, and forced us to innovate. Hunger made us human, even as it still drives us today. So the next time your stomach growls, remember, it is not just emptiness. It is a loop millions of years old, a dance of hormones, neurons, and survival instincts. The growl is your body speaking the language of life itself. A reminder that existence is built on cycles, not straight lines. And the hunger loop, whether you tame it or let it run wild, is one of the deepest loops you will ever live inside. Recursive definitions. At first glance, definitions feel like anchors. They tell us what a thing is, locking meaning into place so we can build knowledge on top of it. But some definitions have a way of turning inward, pointing back to themselves. These are recursive definitions, and they are both powerful and unsettling. Instead of explaining by looking outward, they loop back, making sense only by referencing the very thing you are trying to understand. Take a simple example. A family tree is recursive. You define a descendant as either a child or the descendant of that child. The definition refers back to itself, and suddenly you can generate infinite levels of ancestry from a single rule. Math does this constantly. Factorials, Fibonacci sequences, fractals, all are defined not by expanding endlessly, but by folding the problem back onto itself. To calculate factorial 5, you say 5 times factorial 4. To find Fibonacci 6, you add Fibonacci 5 and Fibonacci 4. Each step leans on a smaller version of itself until you reach the simplest case. Here comes the shock. Recursion is not just a mathematical trick. It is how language itself works. Try to define the word dictionary without recursion. You cannot, because a dictionary is a book that defines words, including the word dictionary. Definitions in human language are tangled webs where words explain each other, but none stand alone. If you chase meanings long enough, you find yourself looping through synonyms and references, caught in a linguistic strange loop. And it gets stranger. Self-referential definitions open the door to paradox, the classic liar's paradox. This sentence is false, is essentially a recursive definition with no grounding. It folds back on itself endlessly, leaving you unable to assign truth or falsehood. The same recursion shows up in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where he encoded statements in math that essentially said, this statement cannot be proven. A recursive definition buried inside mathematics forced math itself to admit its limits. The validation is that recursion feels natural because we live inside recursive systems. Your sense of self is partly a recursive definition. You are you because you recognize yourself as you. Consciousness, some argue, arises when the brain loops back and models its own activity, defining the self by reference to itself. It is the same pattern you see in Escher's drawings of hands sketching each other, or in Bach's fugues repeating themes at different levels. Recursion is not rare. It is the scaffolding of thought, art, and identity. And yet, recursion carries risks. Computers rely on recursive definitions to solve problems elegantly. But when the loop is not grounded with a base case, the program crashes into infinite regress. You might have seen it, a system freezing, overwhelmed by instructions that fold endlessly back on themselves. The same danger exists in thought. Philosophers who define concepts only in terms of themselves risk spiraling into loops that explain nothing. Without grounding, recursion devours clarity. Here is the tease. What if reality itself is recursive? Fractals suggest this possibility. Patterns repeating at smaller and smaller scales, each level defined by reference to the previous one. Zoom into a coastline, a leaf, or a snowflake, and you find the same structures echoing themselves. Physics hints at recursion too. Laws that describe particles look eerily similar to laws that describe galaxies. The universe may be defined not by straight hierarchies, but by loops of self-similarity, recursive structures scaling up and down. Recursive definitions also shape human systems in subtle ways. Laws define themselves through references to other laws. Cultures define values by pointing to traditions, which in turn are defined by those same values. Even personal identity is recursive. You define yourself by your past experiences, but those experiences only matter because you, in the present, choose to see them as defining. The loop is endless, but without it, there would be no stable sense of meaning. What makes recursion so fascinating is its dual nature. On one hand, it is efficient, powerful, almost magical. With a single recursive rule, you can generate infinity. With a single recursive loop, you can define systems too complex to hold all at once. On the other hand, recursion reveals the fragility of meaning. If everything points back to itself, then where does true grounding come from? If definitions are recursive webs, then maybe meaning is not absolute but relational, arising only within the loop. And this is where recursive definitions blur into philosophy. Can you define life? Scientists try. Life is a system capable of self, replication, and metabolism. But notice how that definition folds back. To replicate is to create another life, and metabolism is the maintenance of life itself. Life is defined by life. Consciousness, too, defined as awareness of being conscious. Each of these concepts is not pinned down by something external but by looping inward. Recursion is not a flaw here. It is the very structure of existence. So the next time you run into a recursive definition, do not dismiss it as circular nonsense. See it as a window into how systems sustain themselves, how meaning emerges from loops rather than straight lines. From math to language to mind, recursion is the quiet engine of complexity. It is not a bug, it is the code that makes reality self-sustaining. Recursive definitions remind us that answers do not always lie outside the loop. Sometimes the answer is the loop itself. And if that feels dizzying, that is the point. Recursion shows us that meaning, identity, and even truth may not be linear at all. They may be spirals endlessly folding back, endlessly generating, endlessly alive. Political polarization. Politics is supposed to be about solving problems, about coming together to decide how society should work. But in practice, it often feels like the opposite. The more one side pushes, the more the other side resists. The result is not resolution but escalation, a feedback loop where division feeds division until the middle ground disappears. This is the loop of political polarization. It starts with disagreement, which is natural. People have different values, interests, and visions of the future. But disagreement hardens into identity. When political positions become tied to who you are rather than what you think, the stakes rise. It is no longer about debating ideas. It is about defending your tribe. Criticism of a policy becomes criticism of your identity, and suddenly compromise feels like betrayal. Here is the shock. The loop does not only run between individuals. It runs through the entire system. Media outlets learn that outrage captures attention. Social networks amplify the loudest voices because anger and fear spread faster than reason. Politicians exploit this, framing every issue as a battle of us versus them. And as people consume this content, they grow more extreme, which feeds back into the system, making the next round of media, posts, and campaigns even more polarized. The loop accelerates, and soon both sides are locked in a cycle of mutual escalation. You can see it everywhere. One group stages a protest, the other responds with a counter-protest. One side passes a law, the other vows to repeal it. Each move fuels the next, like two mirrors reflecting each other endlessly, the reflection growing harsher with every round. The shocking part is how self-sustaining this loop becomes. The more polarized people are, the less they trust the other side. And the less they trust, the less they listen. That silence only deepens the divide, ensuring the loop continues. The validation is personal because everyone feels it. Think about a family dinner where political topics come up. Voices rise, people retreat into rehearsed talking points, and suddenly loved ones feel like strangers. Or scroll through social media. Watch how quickly a simple post attracts hostility, how quickly disagreements collapse into insults. These are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a larger feedback system pulling people apart. And if you have felt exhausted by it, you are not alone. Polarization is designed to wear you down because tired people retreat to their corners instead of seeking dialogue. And here comes the tease. What happens if the loop keeps tightening? Political scientists warn that extreme polarization can destabilize democracies. When people see opponents not as rivals but as enemies, violence becomes thinkable. Cooperation collapses, institutions gridlock, and every election feels like an existential fight. The loop spirals until society itself begins to fracture. But the paradox is that the very same loop that tears us apart can also pull us back together, if it is interrupted. Just as outrage spreads outrage, empathy spreads empathy. When individuals step outside the tribal feedback loop, even briefly, the cycle shifts. Research shows that when people hear real stories from those on the other side, rather than slogans or stereotypes, attitudes soften. The loop can run in reverse. But that requires attention, patience, and platforms willing to reward understanding instead of outrage. Polarization is not new. History is full of examples where societies divided sharply along political, religious, or cultural lines. What is new is the speed and scale of modern feedback systems. Algorithms, 24-hour news, viral content, all of them supercharge the loop, shrinking the time between cause and effect. What once took decades to escalate can now happen in months. We are living inside a feedback machine more powerful than any before. And yet the loop also reveals something about human nature. We crave belonging. We want our voices to matter. In times of uncertainty, clinging to a political identity provides comfort, even meaning. The loop feeds on that desire, amplifying it until it turns destructive. But at its core, the drive is not evil. It is human. Understanding that is the first step to loosening the cycle's grip. So where does that leave us? In a paradox of loops. Polarization is not just about politics. It is about psychology, technology, and culture feeding into one another, round after round. The danger is real, but so is the opportunity. Loops magnify whatever flows through them. If division flows in, division grows. But if dialogue flows in, connection grows. The loop itself is neutral. It is our input that determines the outcome. Political polarization is one of the clearest reminders that feedback is power. Loops do not just describe the world, they shape it. And the loop we are in now will not stop on its own. It is up to us, collectively and individually, to decide whether we keep fueling division or find ways to feed something different. Because if we do not, the loop will choose for us. Fermi Paradox Loop. The universe is enormous. Billions of stars in our galaxy, billions of galaxies in the observable cosmos, countless planets orbiting those stars. Logic suggests that somewhere out there, life must exist. Intelligent life, even civilizations capable of interstellar communication. Yet, here we are, on a tiny blue planet alone in silence. That is the Fermi paradox. Where is everybody? The loop emerges when you start thinking about answers. Maybe intelligent life is common, but every civilization destroys itself before achieving interstellar communication. Nuclear war, environmental collapse, AI gone rogue. The list goes on. Or maybe civilizations are rare and life struggles to arise at all, meaning we are an extraordinarily improbable accident. Every hypothesis feeds back into itself. You look for solutions, but each solution generates new questions, spiraling the paradox deeper. Here is the shock. Consider the Great Filter, a concept many scientists invoke to explain the silence. It suggests there is a stage in evolution that is almost impossible to pass. Either we have already survived the filter, making us extraordinarily lucky, or the filter lies ahead, meaning our chances of long-term survival are slim. The loop is psychological as well as cosmic. Our reasoning about the universe folds back on our own existence. Thinking about alien life forces us to confront our own fragility, looping back to the question of why we are still here. And it gets stranger. Some propose that advanced civilizations deliberately avoid contact to prevent cultural contamination or danger. That means silence itself is a signal, but one that only makes sense when you already consider the possibility of other life. The reasoning loops, we see nothing because they hide. We hypothesize they hide because we see nothing. Observation and inference reinforce each other in a feedback spiral, and the paradox strengthens with every iteration. The validation is in our own behavior. Humanity sends out messages, probes, and signals into space, hoping for an answer. And yet, as decades pass without response, we become more cautious, more speculative, more obsessed with the implications. Every attempt to detect life, every null result, feeds into the loop of wonder and anxiety. We are trapped in a recursive contemplation of absence, where the more we search, the more we confront the silence and the unknown. Here comes the tease. Some argue the paradox may not be about aliens at all. It may be about us. Perhaps the universe is not teeming with life, because intelligent life invariably collapses into loops of self, destruction, or stagnation before spreading. Civilization itself may be a feedback system that tends toward extinction or isolation. The Fermi paradox becomes a mirror, showing not only the cosmos but the dynamics of our own species. Think about it. Humanity faces global challenges: climate change, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, technological disruption. Each threat is part of a feedback loop. Actions lead to consequences, consequences alter behavior, and behavior loops back. The same processes that could explain cosmic silence are playing out here. Our ability to survive these loops might determine whether we ever join the hypothetical galactic community. In that sense, the Fermi paradox is not just a cosmic puzzle. It is a warning embedded in the dynamics of life itself. And the paradox deepens. If we imagine countless civilizations, each looping through survival and self-destruction, the universe could be full of dead stars, silent planets, and fossilized societies. The silence is a feedback loop of extinctions. Civilizations arise, loop through challenges, and collapse, leaving no signal behind. Each iteration reinforces the paradox. The more we think about it, the more we see that our expectations of contact are themselves entangled in the loop. The loop is philosophical too. It challenges our assumptions about probability, time, and observation. Are we rare observers in a universe of failed civilizations? Or are we early in a cosmic experiment, observing silence, because we are among the first intelligent species? Each answer changes the frame of the question. The very act of asking loops back into the reasoning process, making the paradox self-referential, a conceptual recursion that spirals outward. So here we are, looking up at the stars, wondering why they are quiet. The Fermi paradox is more than an astrophysical question. It is a loop that folds cosmology into philosophy, speculation into existential reflection. Each explanation generates a new puzzle. Each hypothesis folds back on our understanding of ourselves. Each null result tightens the cycle. The loop is infinite, and the silence is profound. In the end, the Fermi paradox loop is a reminder that the universe may not offer simple answers. The cosmic silence is intertwined with the dynamics of life, the fragility of civilization, and the nature of observation itself. And as we sit here on our tiny planet, pondering distant suns, we realize that the paradox is not just, where are they? It is a loop that forces us to examine where we are and whether we can survive the loops that life inevitably generates. Language versus thought. We often assume that language is just a tool for expressing thought. You think, you speak, and the world understands. But the relationship is far more tangled than that. In fact, thought and language may form a loop so tight that one shapes the other, and understanding it changes how we see the mind itself. Consider how language structures reality. In some cultures, there are words for concepts that don't exist in others. Certain Native American languages, for example, make distinctions for motion or direction that English does not. Speakers of those languages perceive space and time differently because their language pushes attention to things others overlook. The words they know shape what they notice. The loop is subtle but powerful. Language guides thought. Thought generates experience. Experience reinforces language. Here is the shock. Studies show that even basic perception can be altered by the words available. Color recognition is one example. People who have distinct words for shades of blue can discriminate between them faster than people whose language lumps the shades together. Your ability to perceive the world is not just a passive experience. It loops through language, bending reality to the map of words you carry in your mind. Thought shapes language. Language shapes thought. and the cycle never ends. And it gets stranger. Some cognitive scientists suggest that complex reasoning itself relies on language as a scaffold. Without words, organizing abstract ideas or planning long sequences of actions becomes difficult. The inner monologue you take for granted is a form of linguistic looping, where thought rehearses itself through language, reflecting and refining until ideas crystallize. Without language, some argue, thought might remain fleeting, amorphous, incapable of full articulation. The validation is personal. Anyone who has tried to explain a complicated idea knows this loop. You start thinking in generalities, search for the words, adjust your phrasing, realize your initial concept was fuzzy, and refine the idea. By the end, your thought has evolved, shaped directly by the language used to express it. Language is not a passive vessel. It is active, recursive, and participatory in cognition. And here is the tease. If thought and language loop together so tightly, what does that mean for people who speak multiple languages? Research shows bilingual or multilingual people experience shifts in perception and personality depending on which language they use. Speaking one language may make you more analytical, another more emotional, a third more relational. Your thoughts change because the words change, and the words change because your thoughts follow different pathways. The loop folds back on itself in fascinating ways. This also explains why translating poetry or humor is so difficult. Words are not neutral. They carry patterns of thought, cultural assumptions, and perceptual biases. When a phrase jumps from one language to another, some elements of the underlying thought either mutate or disappear. The loop between language and thought is disrupted, leaving gaps, echoes, and reinterpretations. Language and thought are inseparable partners, and breaking the loop exposes just how dependent each is on the other. The loop has implications beyond perception or cognition. It shapes memory and identity. We think of life events not only through feelings but through narratives constructed in words. Retelling an experience in language reorganizes the memory itself. The story you tell yourself about who you are influences your future actions, which generate more memories, which you again narrate. The loop between language and thought becomes the loop of self, shaping both perception and existence. And yet, the paradox is that thought can exist without language. Infants, nonverbal people, and animals think, make decisions, and solve problems without words. But as soon as language enters the system, the loop transforms cognition. Thought is amplified, abstracted, and recursive. Language does not create thought, but it dramatically reshapes it, folding perception, reasoning, and memory into a feedback system of astonishing complexity. So here we are, living inside this loop every day, rarely noticing it. The words you know influence how you see the world, how you remember it, how you plan, and even who you are. Thought reaches outward, and language reaches back, each shaping and amplifying the other, a perpetual dance of mind and word. Understanding this loop is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a way to see why people think differently, why cultures diverge, and why communication is as much about shaping thought as expressing it. Language versus thought is not a battle. It is a loop. And once you recognize it, you begin to see the subtle, recursive ways your own mind is shaped, molded, and amplified by the words it uses. The loop is alive, dynamic, and unending, and it may be one of the most fundamental structures of human cognition itself. Self-model loop. Every moment, your brain is running a simulation of itself. It is predicting your actions, your reactions, even your feelings. This is the self-model, a dynamic, internal representation of you that guides behavior and perception. But here is the twist: the self-model is not just a reflection, it is a loop. Your brain models you, and that model shapes your behavior, which feeds back into the model, which reshapes your behavior again. This is the self-model loop. It starts simply. You decide to pick up a cup of coffee. Your brain predicts how your arm will move, how the cup will feel, how your grip will work. The action itself confirms or violates that prediction. If the cup slips, the model updates. If it goes smoothly, the model reinforces itself. This loop happens thousands of times a day, constantly refining your sense of self and your interaction with the world. Every decision, every movement, every reaction is both output and input in this recursive system. Here is the shock. The self-model is not limited to physical actions. It extends to thoughts, emotions, and social perception. You anticipate how others see you, and that anticipation shapes your behavior, which in turn changes how others react, which loops back to your self-model. Smile at someone because you think they expect friendliness, notice them smile back, and your self-concept of friendly person is reinforced. The loop is everywhere, invisible but powerful, folding social reality back into your identity. And it gets stranger. Some neuroscientists propose that consciousness itself emerges from this loop. You are aware of yourself because your brain constantly predicts and monitors its own states. Thoughts about thoughts, feelings about feelings. These are layers of self-modeling folded back on themselves. The I you experience is a product of prediction and feedback, a recursive structure where the observer and the observed are intertwined. In other words, you may be aware of yourself because your brain is running a loop complex enough to notice itself. The validation is immediate if you think about introspection. When you plan your day, you anticipate your reactions to tasks and people. When you reflect, you evaluate your past choices, update your model of self, and adjust future behavior. Even imagination is a loop. You simulate scenarios internally, test them against your self-model, and refine your sense of possible actions. Every mental process loops through the self-model, shaping not just what you do, but who you are. Here is the tease. This loop explains why habits are so powerful, and why breaking them is so hard. Repeated behaviors reinforce your self-model predictions. If you see yourself as someone who exercises daily, your brain anticipates success, making it easier to act consistently. Conversely, if you see yourself as someone who fails, the loop reinforces that expectation, creating self-fulfilling prophecies. The self-model loop is not just a cognitive trick. It is the machinery of identity, constantly folding past, present, and predicted future into a coherent sense of self. And the paradox is fascinating. The self-model is flexible enough to change, yet it is also resistant. It updates in response to feedback, but it also protects itself to maintain coherence. If a new behavior conflicts too sharply with existing predictions, the brain may ignore it or reinterpret it to fit the loop. This is why people can act against their best interests without truly feeling changed. The loop preserves the internal model while the external world shifts. The self-model loop also explains disorders of identity and perception. In conditions like depersonalization or certain forms of schizophrenia, the loop malfunctions. The predictive model of self fails to align with sensory feedback, producing a sense of detachment or unreality. Conversely, positive reinforcement loops can strengthen self-efficacy, resilience, and adaptive behavior. Understanding the loop is crucial for both neuroscience and psychology, because it is the structure underlying the very experience of being a self. This loop extends into culture and technology. Social media, for example, feeds the self-model loop externally. Likes, comments, and feedback shape your internal model of self-worth and identity. Every post, every reaction, every share loops back into predictions about how you behave online and offline. The self-model is not just biological, it is social, dynamic, and responsive to environments, both physical and digital. So here we are, living inside the self-model loop constantly, often without noticing. Every choice, every reflection, every action feeds back into the system that predicts, monitors, and adjusts the I that experiences them. It is a loop of prediction and confirmation, reflection and adjustment, perception and reality, endlessly folding back on itself. Understanding this loop is not just an academic exercise. It is a glimpse into the mechanics of consciousness and the architecture of identity itself. In the end, the self-model loop shows us that the self is not a static thing. It is a dynamic, recursive structure, constantly shaping and reshaping itself through interaction with the world and the mind. You are not merely observing yourself, you are living inside a loop that generates the very experience of being you. And recognizing the loop is the first step toward understanding how profoundly flexible, yet resilient, the human self really is. Co-evolution loops. Life does not evolve in isolation. Every species is part of an intricate web where survival depends on others. Predators shape prey, prey shape predators, plants shape pollinators, pollinators shape plants. When two or more species evolve in response to each other, we call it co-evolution, and the loops it creates are some of the most fascinating feedback systems in nature. It starts simply. Imagine a flower and a bee. The flower evolves brightly colored petals and nectar to attract pollinators. The bee evolves specialized senses and feeding structures to access that nectar more efficiently. Each change in one species triggers a response in the other. Over generations, the traits of both species become intertwined in a loop, each evolution pushing the other forward. One cannot be fully understood without the other. Here is the shock. Co-evolutionary loops can drive extreme adaptations that seem almost unbelievable. Think of the orchid with a nectar spur over a foot long and the moth with a tongue long enough to reach it. Darwin predicted this in Madagascar and imagined a pollinator yet to be discovered. Centuries later, a moth matching that description was found. The loop of adaptation had pushed evolution to a very specific, almost impossible intersection of biology. One species' evolution literally created a selective pressure for the other, spiraling together across time. And it gets stranger. Co-evolution is not always about cooperation. Sometimes it is arms races, where each species' adaptation pressures the other to escalate. Predators evolve sharper teeth, prey evolve tougher armor or faster speed. Parasites and hosts engage in genetic cat and mouse games that can span millennia. Each innovation triggers a counter-innovation, looping endlessly in a cycle that fuels both diversity and specialization. The loop is invisible but powerful, driving the extraordinary variety of life we see today. The validation is obvious in everyday nature. Plants release chemicals to deter herbivores, and herbivores evolve enzymes to neutralize them. Trees and fungi exchange nutrients through underground networks, each shaping the growth and survival of the other. Even humans are part of co-evolutionary loops. Our diets shaped our digestive systems, our immune systems co-evolved with pathogens, and cultural practices influenced our biology. We are both participants and products of loops that stretch far beyond our immediate perception. here comes the tease. Co-evolutionary loops can scale into ecosystems and even planetary processes. Think of bees pollinating crops, which humans cultivate and protect. The loop extends to agriculture, economics, and ecology, where human evolution interacts with other species, sometimes stabilizing ecosystems, sometimes destabilizing them. The loop is not only biological, but cultural, technological, and environmental, a recursive dance between species across multiple levels. But there is a paradox. Co-evolution loops can produce fragility as well as resilience. When species become highly specialized to each other, the survival of one depends entirely on the other. Extinction in one partner can collapse the loop, leading to cascading failures. Coral reefs are a prime example. Corals and algae co-evolved in tight symbiosis, but environmental stress can break the loop, causing mass die-offs. The same mechanism that drives astonishing adaptation also creates vulnerability. The loop also explains patterns of mimicry, deception, and competition. Some plants evolve to mimic the appearance or scent of other species to attract pollinators or deter predators. Some predators mimic harmless species to sneak up on prey. Each mimic triggers counter adaptations in the other, spiraling into complex, sometimes bewildering biological strategies. Nature is filled with loops of adaptation within adaptation, feedback upon feedback, producing forms and behaviors that seem designed, but are really the emergent property of recursive evolution. And humans are caught in these loops, too. Agriculture, domestication, and medicine are all interventions that create new co-evolutionary pressures. Crops evolve resistance to pests. Pests evolve resistance to pesticides. Bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. Cultural innovations, like cities, diets, or trade, create loops in which human biology, behavior, and ecology co-adapt. These are not hypothetical. They are daily realities. Our actions feed the loop, and the loop reshapes our world in ways that are often unpredictable. The broader lesson is that life is fundamentally interconnected, a series of nested loops where every action reverberates. Evolution is rarely linear because species do not evolve in isolation. The feedback of adaptation loops across time and species, producing complexity, diversity, and sometimes instability. The loop is both creative and unforgiving, shaping the biosphere as a web of intertwined destinies. So here we are, looking at co-evolution not as a series of separate events, but as loops folding back on themselves, each species both influencing and being influenced. These loops drive the evolution of traits, behaviors, ecosystems, and even culture. Understanding them is not just about biology. It is about seeing life as a dynamic network of recursive interactions, where every change echoes, sometimes for millennia. Co-evolution loops remind us that survival is rarely solo. Life exists in feedback and reflection in response. Every species is both actor and reactor in loops that extend across time, space, and even into human society. Recognizing these loops is understanding the engine of evolution itself. It is a system alive, self-reinforcing, and endlessly complex. Addiction feedback. Addiction is not just a personal failing or a moral flaw. It is a loop, a feedback system woven into the brain's reward circuits, shaping desire, behavior, and perception in ways that feel almost impossible to escape. To understand addiction, you have to see it not as a moment of weakness, but as a recursive cycle where biology and environment amplify each other endlessly. It starts with reward. When you do something pleasurable, eat sugar, play a game, smoke, or use a substance, your brain releases dopamine. That chemical floods the reward pathways, signaling that what you just did is worth repeating. Normally, Dopamine is a guide, telling you what actions support survival. But addictive behaviors hijack this system, creating loops that escalate beyond natural reward. Here is the shock. The first exposure changes your brain. Neural pathways strengthen around the behavior. Receptors adjust so that over time, the same action produces less pleasure. You need more, faster, or riskier behavior to reach the same high. Each repetition feeds back into the loop. Craving grows, consumption grows, and the loop reinforces itself. What started as curiosity or habit becomes compulsion, a self-amplifying cycle with biological momentum. And it gets stranger. Addiction is not only chemical, it is cognitive and social. Cues in the environment trigger cravings: seeing a certain place, hearing a sound, smelling a scent. These cues activate memory and anticipation in the brain, looping attention toward the addictive behavior before conscious thought even occurs. Your environment becomes part of the feedback system, shaping the next action, which strengthens memory, which shapes the environment's influence, and so on. The loop is recursive, wrapping thought, habit, and circumstance into one unstoppable spiral. The validation is painfully human. Anyone who has tried to quit a habit knows the feedback loop firsthand. Willpower alone is rarely enough. Even when the substance or behavior is absent, craving loops back into your thoughts. Dopamine spikes, anticipation triggers physiological responses, and the mind nudges you toward relapse. Each cycle reinforces the next, teaching your brain that seeking the substance is not just pleasurable. It is necessary to maintain stability in the system. Here comes the tease. Addiction is not purely destructive. It is instructive. It reveals how deeply feedback shapes behavior and how biology can be both adaptive and maladaptive. The same circuits that make humans curious, motivated, and social can also trap us in loops of repetition. It is not a failure of character. It is the predictable outcome of a recursive system designed to reinforce survival behaviors, hijacked by modern stimuli. And the paradox is sharp. Recovery requires breaking the loop, but the loop itself resists disruption. Abstaining reduces dopamine spikes, which can make life feel flat. Behavioral triggers still activate craving. Social environments may reinforce old patterns. To escape, you must not only stop the addictive behavior, but rewire the brain's feedback system, creating new loops of reward, anticipation, and reinforcement that support health rather than compulsion. The loop extends beyond substances. Modern technology, social media, video games, and even shopping can hijack the same reward circuits. Likes, notifications, and micro rewards trigger dopamine, reinforcing attention and engagement. The brain's learning systems fold these behaviors into habit loops, creating digital addictions that mirror chemical ones. The same principles apply: small, repeatable rewards, escalating engagement, cues in the environment, and recursive reinforcement. The feedback loop is the pattern, addiction is the outcome, and humans are not helpless. Awareness of the feedback loop changes how you intervene. Cognitive, behavioral strategies work because they disrupt the loop, replacing triggers, shifting rewards, altering cues, and introducing new behaviors that feed the brain with healthier dopamine signals. Social support, routine changes, mindfulness, and structured goals all rewire the loop gradually. Addiction is powerful because it is feedback amplified, but the same principles allow reversal. Loops can be reprogrammed, even if it takes persistence. So here we are, living in a world full of loops designed to capture attention, create desire, and reinforce behavior. Addiction is the clearest example of how feedback shapes human experience. It shows that behavior is not linear, Choice is not isolated, and consequences are magnified across cycles. Each action, each craving, each reinforcement folds back on itself, producing the compulsive patterns we call addiction. The lesson is profound. Addiction feedback is not only about substances. It is about loops, reward, and recursive systems in the brain. Understanding it changes the narrative from blame to comprehension, from punishment to intervention. The feedback loop explains the power of compulsion, the challenge of recovery, and the deep, recursive structures that shape all motivated behavior. Recognizing the loop is the first step toward stepping out of it, rewiring it, and reclaiming autonomy over mind and action. Infinite loops in code. You hit run and everything freezes. The spinner spins and the console never returns. The UI is unresponsive. The server stops responding, and your heart drops because you know exactly what that means. Somewhere in the code a loop refused to stop. An infinite loop is simple in concept, but brutal in consequence. It teaches you how small logic errors can jam an entire system, and once you see how the loop works, you start spotting them everywhere, not just in code. At first it looks like a tiny mistake, a missing increment, a wrong comparison, a condition that never becomes false. One line of code can cause a function to circle forever. But here is the shock. Infinite loops do more than hang your app. They can exhaust memory, throttle CPUs, lock databases, and cascade into outages that take teams hours to diagnose. A single runaway process can bring down services, cause financial losses, and ruin trust. Why do they happen? Part of it is human habit. We write loops because repetition is useful. Process every item in a list, pull for updates, retray a network call. But every repetition needs a clear exit. Forget that exit and the loop becomes a prison. Off by one errors are classic. Recursion without a base case piles on the stack until the system gives up. Sneaky infinite loops hide in concurrent code, where two threads wait for each other or for a condition that will never be met. Deadlocks, livelocks, and starvation are cousins of the infinite loop. Race conditions can make loops behave correctly most of the time and explode under production timing. That makes them dangerous and infuriating because tests pass locally while real-world load turns the loop into an outage. Think about recovery strategies. Experienced engineers build guardrails. Timeouts, watchdogs, and circuit breakers are practical hedges. If a call takes too long, kill it and retry. If a system misbehaves, trip a circuit so dependent services do not collapse. Throttling limits how fast loops consume resources. Observability is a must. Logs, metrics, and traces help you spot a loop before it eats the CPU. But these are mitigations, not miracles. The only true cure is correct logic. You have felt this loop, even if you do not write code. Rehearse an argument in your head and return to the same thought again and again. Check your phone hoping for a message and refresh endlessly. Those are human infinite loops. In psychology, they show up as rumination and compulsion. The same structure underlies both a crashed process and a mind that cannot move forward. In distributed systems, a loop on one node can flood a message queue, which floods other nodes, which retree, which flood the original node back. Self-amplification leads to cascade failure. Monitoring alarms and auto-scaling have sometimes made the situation worse by reacting to the loop. The very tools meant to absorb load can become participants if not carefully designed. Consider security. A badly designed loop is an attack vector. Resource exhaustion attacks deliberately trigger loops to degrade service. Bots hammer endpoints, causing retries that overwhelm backends. Without rate limits and idempotency, Infinite loops enable denial of service. In finance or healthcare, the cost of a loop can be measured in dollars and in lives. This is operational hazard, not theoretical risk. Infinite loops teach important lessons about design. They force you to think about invariance, termination conditions, and graceful failure modes. Proving termination is a formal method. You can reason about loops, show they decrease a metric, and therefore must stop. Modular design isolates retries and side effects, so loops cannot reach too much of the system. Defensive programming anticipates failure modes and breaks chains before they become unstoppable. There is beauty here too. Control systems exploit feedback to stabilize temperature or speed. The difference is that those loops are monitored and damped. The worst loops have positive feedback only, no damping, no stop condition, just exponential growth until something breaks. Controlled feedback versus uncontrolled recursion is the distinction engineers fight to keep. So what do we do? Build safeguards, write tests fuzz, and use formal verification where it matters. Throttle, timeout, and instrument. Code reviews should look for exit conditions. Chaos engineering reveals hidden timing bugs. Treat a hanging process like a fire to investigate, not a nuisance to ignore. Loops are social as well as technical problems. Teams shape systems, and systems shape habits. The darker truth is that as systems fragment into hundreds or thousands of services, subtle infinite behavior becomes more likely. Interactions you never imagined become possible. A loop that needs 3 services and a specific timing might live silently for months until load aligns. The larger the system, the quieter the failures, and the longer a loop can run before noticed. That is why simplicity, clear contracts, and thoughtful retray logic matter. Infinite loops in code expose assumptions we never questioned and the fragility of systems bound by human logic. They remind us that repetition demands intention, automation needs humility, and every loop is a promise to stop somewhere. When it does not, consequences reach far beyond the cursor blinking in your editor.